Chapter 661, Yuking and Changdi I. At Mount Qingdu, Li Zijian stepped out of the hall, where a middle-aged man whose Taoist robe was embroidered with intricate patterns had been waiting. Liu Changdi's eyebrows rose as he appraised him and said softly, "Congratulations on reaching the Foundation Establishment realm, nephew." Li Zijian nodded and responded politely, "Greetings, uncle." Liu Changdi examined the young man in white. Upon closer inspection, he felt that Li Zijian carried himself with the grace and calmness of falling snow. It was somewhat different from the youth in his memories. He could not help but sigh inwardly. It seems the Tao of frost and snow truly suits the eighth young master. Compared to the person I knew in my previous life, Li Zijian has shed some of that cynical coldness and instead gained a restrained sharpness that lies hidden beneath the snow. He may not have the reputation of his past self, but his temperament has grown. A faint trace of delight flickered across Liu Changdi's face. When he thought about it, the only young master he had yet to meet was Li Ziming. He wondered what the young man looked like now. He estimated that Li Ziming should have reached the Foundation Establishment realm as well. While Liu Changdi was lost in thought, Li Zijian's gaze briefly swept over him. Li Zijian thought, "My family mentioned that this man might be carrying a thread of fate within him. Judging by his appearance, that seems to be true." Realizing his absent-mindedness, Liu Changdi returned to his senses and smiled. "Young nephew, the grand formation has been fully set up. We are only waiting for the nobles to inspect it." Li Zijian signaled him to proceed with a discreet gesture. As they walked, Liu Changdi continued with a grin. "This formation contains all 5 types of spirit water of the water virtue. It arranges these waters into formation points using 10 formation platforms scattered across Mount Qingdu. Thus, the 5 waters can be controlled to block enemies. I call it the Heaven Guarding Formation of 5 waters. As long as your esteemed clan activates this formation, it will tap into the water veins of this lake and Mount Qingdu to support its defenses. The formation will manifest 5 layers of water barriers that are capable of withstanding cultivators up to the mid-stage of Foundation Establishment realm." Li Zijian and Liu Changdi rode the wind into the sky until they stood above the mountain's peak. Liu Changdi took a small flag from his sleeve and gently waved it. He turned to Li Zijian with a smile and said, "This formation is the culmination of my life's work. I dare say that every formation master at the Foundation Establishment realm in Jiangnan would have to bow their heads before me. Even if Wan Huiqian clawed his way out of his grave to achieve the Foundation Establishment realm, he might still be a step behind me." It was no wonder Li Changdi boasted so boldly. In Yue State, the name Wan Huiqian was often mentioned when it came to formation masters. He had created countless simplified formations that were now spread throughout Yue State. His reputation was only a little less widespread than Li Qijing in his prime. However, Liu Changdi's mention of Wan Huiqian sent a sudden thought sparking through Li Zijian's mind. Where exactly did the Wan family's formation inheritance end up? The Wan family's downfall had been personally recorded by Li Tongya. The Li family had got their hands on the Jai family's legacy, yet nothing related to the Wan family's formations had ever surfaced. Perhaps Jai Dengqi delivered it to the Golden Tang Gate, thought Li Zijian, but as he continued to conjecture, the spiritual energy over Mount Qingdu suddenly shifted. 10 streaks of cold light shot into the sky, weaving a brilliant blue barrier that descended from above. Liu Changdi explained, "This is the first water manifestation, pristine water. It is called Morning Mist." He gently formed a hand seal. A gray mist began to rise rapidly from the surface of the lake, cutting off any spiritual sense probing as it shrouded the area. The mist was as fine as silk as it crept upwards and began winding around Li Zijian's robes. A hint of surprise appeared on Li Zijian's face. He lightly flicked his sleeve, dispersing the mist, but it crept back like a malignant parasite. He activated his perception technique, and everything became clear to him in an instant. It was clear that the mist had no real effect on him. Li Zijian was not particularly surprised. His perception technique was enhanced by talisman qi, so it would have been stranger if he had failed to see through it. Meanwhile, Liu Changdi continued, "As long as this first water manifestation stands, no number of qi cultivation cultivators would be able to break through." He formed another hand seal and softly uttered, "Serpent Stream." The lake surrounding Mount Qingdu began to churn violently. Numerous agile water serpents rose from the lake. They twisted across the surface of the water with fierce and menacing expressions, weapons in hand. Liu Changdi explained, "This is also meant to defend against qi cultivation cultivators. The water beasts summoned by the formation can hide within the mist and attack enemies while guarding the formation." Liu Changdi proclaimed, "Pure essence." Another layer of water manifestation unfolded as a green-gray radiance shimmered over Liu Changdi's body. It made him appear lighter, as though his entire body had become more agile. It was clearly a formation art meant to bolster his allies. This particular layer was not especially impressive, since it lacked the striking impact of the first 2 water manifestations. Liu Changdi seemed to understand this as well, so he did not dwell on it and swiftly changed his hand seals. Grounded. The wind beneath Li Zijin's feet suddenly grew heavy, his footing suddenly grew unstable, and he was forced to channel his mana to steady himself. However, the sinking pressure was peculiar. It seemed to intensify with time, continuously draining h's mana. Liu Changdi's face lit up with pride as he grinned. It's all thanks to this rare spirit water from the water mansion system. This spirit water actually possesses some properties of inferior water, which is how I could enhance this anti-flight restriction to such a degree. Even Foundation Establishment Realm cultivators would need to think twice when facing this level of drain. Li Zijin's eyebrows rose in surprise. Since this spell intensified with time, it was indeed different from ordinary anti-flight techniques. He thought to himself, I heard sister-in-law provided this spirit water from the water mansion system. She didn't say much, but this is clearly a rare treasure. It must be a high-grade spirit water from the water mansion system. It seems I owe her a favor. Liu Changdi was in high spirits. Without pausing, his hand seals shifted again, summoning the final layer of water manifestation. He laughed as he declared, layered flow. The surface of the lake surged violently. Waves rapidly rose and climbed up the mountain until it enveloped the entire brilliant blue formation, and by extension, Mount Qingdu in a thick layer of dark gray-black water. The water seemed steady and unyielding, giving off a sense of unwavering defense. Li Zijin carefully observed every detail until Liu Changdi finally released his spell. The layers of water manifestations quickly dissipated, restoring the area to its original state. Only then did Li Zijin let out a sigh as he said, Uncle, my family hesitated and delayed, yet you bore no resentment. Instead, you poured even more effort into crafting this formation. How can I accept this without feeling ashamed? Li Zijin was well aware that what his family had provided was far from sufficient to construct such a formation. Liu Changdi must have quietly added a significant amount of his own resources. The sheer magnificence of this formation made it clear that it was no ordinary Foundation Establishment Realm formation. He sighed inwardly, reached into his sleeve, and took out a storage pouch, intending to offer it as additional compensation. However, Liu Changdi waved his hand firmly and said in a low voice, I've been through many years of hardship. I'm not that fool from back then anymore. There are countless eyes watching me from the shadows. I know my limits. No matter what, don't speak of favors. In the end, I won't become a burden to your clan. Li Zijin stiffened slightly. Liu Changdi's words rang true. After years of venturing and exploring, Liu Changdi was no longer the reckless young man he once was. He could tell that the Li family was trying to avoid owing him a favor and be entangled in future troubles. It was a ruthless move, but Li Zijin now found himself at a loss for words at Liu Changdi's broad-mindedness. Liu Changdi said warmly, This is my repayment to you and Jiao. I understand many things. If your family still has faith in who I am, please do not keep forcing me to take any more of your spirit stones. His eyes was clear and his voice open and sincere. His request had firmly blocked any further offers of payment from Li Zijin. Liu Changdi smiled lightly and swiftly shifted the topic. I have had the chance to meet all the young masters, except for nephew Ziming, I wonder. Li Zijin smiled politely, though he felt a tinge of sorrow in his heart. He replied, How unfortunate. Ziming is currently in seclusion to attempt a breakthrough. Liu Changdi could only nod, a trace of regret in his expression. In his past life, his daughter had been Li Ziming's concubine. Thus, he had some personal ties to Li Ziming. Even Ziming's son, Li Chenghui, had studied formations under him. When he thought back to his disciple, Liu Changdi felt a wave of nostalgia and said with a smile, I once heard that the bright Yang Dao lineage is the most fertile. I wonder if that is true. May I ask how nephew Ziming's descendants are faring? Li Zijin, however, was troubled precisely because of this matter. Ziming's eldest son had recently undergone a root bone assessment, only to reveal he possessed no spiritual orifices. This had cast a shadow over Li Zijin's mood. So he merely waved his hand and said, I believe that is merely a rumor. Ziming's offspring are few and his son has no spiritual energy. These words left Liu Changdi stunned. His heart sank and a cold dread crept over him. He worried that he might have unknowingly caused some disaster. He thought to himself, how could this be? How? Meng Zhuoyan is from the overseas Meng family, and the Li family are descendants of Foundation Establishment Realm cultivators. How could this have happened? The image of his disciple's obedient face appeared in his mind, making his chest tighten with unease. His heart skipped a beat and he could not resist asking, Forgive this old man for prying. May I ask who young Master Ziming's wife is? Madam N, replied Li Zijin. Madam N. Liu Changdi slowly closed his eyes. Li Zijin noticed that Li Changdi's questions were becoming rather strange. Still, he had answered naturally due to the man's earlier sincerity. Chapter 662, Yuking and Changdi II. Liu Changdi's heart was drowning in bitterness. A sour, painful ache welled up within him as he thought to himself. Perhaps Meng Zhuoyan died on the journey here. It's over. All over. He suddenly felt like he had fallen into a dream. A wave of heat washed over his limbs, and the calm he had maintained so far shattered. He He stood there in midair, dazed and spiritless as his gaze fell. Even when the person beside him called his name, he could not hear it. Though his body still moved through the motions of a respectful bow, his heart had already shattered into pieces. When he finally came back to his senses, he had landed in the town below. He took a few steps forward and raised his head to squint at the plaque above the gate. It read Hu Mansion. Unknowingly, he had returned to his home from his previous life. Yet, it no longer bore the name Liu Mansion. He could only turn and walk away, his expression blank, as though his soul had been taken away. His spiritual sense trembled as it swept rapidly through the mansion. Then he faintly heard a gentle song. He froze and flickered. An instant later, he landed within the Hu Mansion's courtyard, where a woman was dancing. Clearly, she was a cultivator, as evidenced by the terror that appeared on her face when she felt his spiritual sense appear in the court. Her features were delicate, with a sorrowful beauty to them. Her body seemed frail, which was a far cry from the proud elegance he remembered from his previous life. Unlike his previous life, in which she had reached the 5th stage of the embryonic breathing realm, her cultivation barely reached the profound scenery realm. However, the aura of Liu Changdi's foundation establishment realm was undeniable. The entire courtyard immediately fell to their knees with a rustling sound. Liu Changdi felt his chest tighten as his breath stuttered. He opened his mouth but could only utter a hoarse sound of acknowledgement. His wife was kneeling before him. Behind her, the master of the mansion, Master Hu, belatedly rushed out. He too prostrated himself on the ground. Kinger. Liu Changdi called out her name in a choked voice. He understood why he had not come looking for her until now. When he had been reborn, he had been overjoyed. So many regrets from his previous life laid bare before him, waiting to be corrected. Yet not once had his wife or daughter crossed his mind. Now, he understood that from the very moment he was reborn, he had already dismissed Madame Liu as beneath him. Even though they had shared decades as husband and wife, the moment he had been reborn, all those years had been cast aside like nothing. He had truly believed that he would no longer be that mediocre, opportunistic rogue cultivator of his past life. He would no longer be that useless Liu Changdi. He would become a foundation establishment realm cultivator. He might even ascend to the Purple Mansion realm. He would marry a fairy of an immortal sect. He would embrace a beauty from a prestigious family. In the depths of his heart, he had harbored despicable thoughts of discarding everything from his past life. The women he would meet in this life, both in temperament and appearance, would far surpass Madame Liu. They owed nothing to each other as husband and wife, so why should he marry a mere village woman? So he had erased those decades from his heart in one breath. He had not thought of her, not even once. Even when something reminded him of her, he would brush it off with a laugh and push it to the back of his mind. But when he saw Madame Liu's face pale with shock and fear, he felt like he had been struck over the head by a heavy hammer. Memories of their wedding night, her bashful smile, and the warmth of their family together all flooded back at once. His throat tightened as if something were lodged in it, forcing out an ugly cough. Liu Changdi had always remembered Madame Liu as plump, and because of this, he had disliked her for a long time. It was only later that she captivated him with her gentle patience and devoted admiration. It was only now that he realized she also had a gaunt, frail, and delicate side to her. She had only had that spark in her eyes in their past life because she loved him. Meanwhile, Master Hu's expression shifted drastically, and he muttered in disbelief, Kinger. Shame flickered across his face for an instant, but it was quickly replaced by a calculating look. After all, Madame Liu was merely a concubine. If he could gain the favor of a foundation establishment realm cultivator, endless wealth and status would follow. Master Hu grinned obsequiously and said, my lord, this is Yuking. She's most skilled in singing the gentlest songs." Master Hu muttered inwardly, although she recently suffered a miscarriage and is still somewhat weak. He did not dare speak his thoughts aloud. But Liu Changdi had scanned everything with his foundation establishment realm's spiritual sense. He knew it all, even down to the cold-natured medicine that had harmed her. He watched as Master Hu reached out to push Madame Liu forward. Madame Liu was trembling, her face filled with confusion and fear as she stumbled and collapsed before him. Liu Changdi, a man who had experienced all the cruelties of life, saw everything with piercing clarity. His heart burned with pain. His eyes stung as he shouted, "Deserved." He laughed and cried at the same time as he rose into the sky. A bitter metallic taste surged in his throat and he cursed aloud, "I deserve it." Liu Changdi fled skyward as though running for his life. He had survived countless brushes with death in the Eastern Sea over the years, but never had he flown as fast as he did now. The way Madame Liu looked at him, and her wretched state felt like an immortal sword. He knew that if he hesitated for even a moment, that sword would pierce him, condemning him to eternal torment. How many years have I lived since my rebirth? All I ever cared about was lining my own pockets. My heart was filled with greed, and I only sought to snatch the fortunes of others. How many heroes and fateful bonds have I ruined along the way? Forget preventing the devil plague's downpour. Have I ever saved a single person? I should have had self-control, but I was nothing more than a cowardly, vulgar mortal. Still, even though I was given another chance at life, I squandered countless spirit items and destroyed even more future heroes' opportunities. How many young talents who could have risen were lost during the Devil Plague? How many common people suffered as a result? At this moment, Liu Changdi finally understood. His entire rebirth had been nothing but a pathetic farce. He was a mediocre man occupying a position meant for greatness, causing those truly worthy to lament their lost fates. He was no hero. He was short-sighted. Even if he lived through multiple lifetimes, he would always be the same. He had harmed his wife, his daughter, his brothers, and his elders. He only needed to look at his wife's fate in this life. Without his help, and amidst the decline of the Li family, she had fallen to such a miserable state, married as a concubine. Persecuted, lost her child. That charming woman from my previous life was reduced to a withered husk. Female cultivators of the Li family would rarely become concubines. Usually the same would apply to the Liu family, but it was clear they had suffered a major defeat in an internal struggle. That was the only way a mere branch member like Kinger would have fallen into such a pitiful state. Although Liu Changdi had not lived within the Li family, he knew their internal affairs well. Bitterness flooded his heart as he recalled her slightly plump face and how she had smiled gently at him. The gentle happiness on her face was now shattered by the terrified expression he had just seen. His throat tightened as he choked out, "What use is this cultivation?" Liu Changdi could have chosen to look away. He owed her nothing. This Madame Liu was not the Madame Liu from his previous life. He had always prided himself on being selfish and self-serving, but he still had a shred of conscience. Kinger, Yuan Jiao, Cheng Hui, little girl. Under the deep night sky, that last shred of conscience reduced this proud foundation establishment realm cultivator to a man whose legs trembled. He stood in the sky for a moment and then plummeted into the lake below like a bird with broken wings. Chapter 663, Chen Yang I. Liu Changdi crawled out of the lake as dawn broke. His feathered robe had not let even a drop of water stain it. He staggered along the shore in a daze, as he realized that everything from the past had vanished without a trace. He didn't know what to do, and simply rode the wind toward the mountains. It was not until he reached Mount Qingdu that Liu Changdi realized he still had the formation flag. He had no choice but to pass through the formation and head toward the hall Li Zijian had occupied. Liu Changdi stepped inside after the armored guards at the gate reported his presence. An elderly man with white hair and a white beard, clad in black and gold armor, was seated inside. The man's eyebrows rose as he exclaimed, "Taoist Changdi, brother Xuanfeng," replied Liu Changdi as he hurried forward to greet Li Xuanfeng. Liu Changdi was momentarily rendered speechless when he carefully examined the latter. Li Xuanfeng was the first member of the Li family he had seen in this life. Liu Changdi had only heard of Li Xuanfeng's renowned astral golden bow technique in his previous life, but in this life they had met as youths and forged a bond. Li Xuanfeng was examining his friend and noticed his lost and hollow-eyed appearance. Although Liu Changdi's foundation establishment aura was deep and clearly not from an ordinary cultivation technique, his breath was short and his heart was wavering. He seemed at a loss. The two stood in the hall. One had once been brimming with youthful vigor, passionate and bold. He wielded a golden bow and dared to shoot anything. Now he was cold-eyed and white-haired, driven by others to protect his family. The other had once been full of ambition, rising to fame as he formed bonds with heroes through his mastery of formation arts. Now he was empty-handed and alone. They looked at each other, and their eyes said everything. He fumbled out a jade box from his storage pouch, but Liu Changdi had lost interest. He handed over the formation flag and said softly, "If you truly wish to thank me, there is a concubine that goes by the surname Liu in the town's Hu family. She is a distant relative of mine. Look after her on my behalf, and that will suffice as thanks." Li Xuanfeng frowned as an exhausted Liu Changdi pressed his Shenyang mansion point and softly said, "Brother Xuanfeng, you can see that I am troubled by inner demons. I truly cannot delay. I must hurry to find spirit items and secret techniques to suppress it. I should not linger. Forgive me, forgive me." Li Xuanfeng was a straightforward person, so when he saw Liu Changdi's face covered in cold sweat, he had no choice but to escort him out. He watched as Liu Changdi took out his flying shuttle and quickly disappeared into the distance. Li Xuanzheng rode the wind back to the hall, where Li Zijian was already waiting. Li Xuanfeng valued Li Zijian the most among the younger generation of the Li family. His expression softened a little as he asked, "What happened with Yuexiang?" Li Zijian explained the whole situation and his speculations. Li Xuanfeng's stern expression eased slightly, and he said quietly, "Although it was unavoidable, does that mean my family can be humiliated without reason? I will pay a visit to the Yuan family soon. If Yuan Haiyuan wants to cut ties with us, I'll make sure he completely understands the consequences." Li Zijian nodded. Though he was also holding a grudge over his sister's matter, he still advised, "Azure Pond has issued strict orders against crossing borders and involving neighboring counties. The Yuan family is a natural ally due to geography. If lives are lost, it may not bode well. Li Xuanfeng simply waved his hand in response, his face unusually showing a rare smile. He said, "Let's not speak of this further. I have my own arrangements. First, take me to see that promising junior. I want to see what he looks like now." At the Chen residence, Chen Mufeng rode the wind back to his residence, where he was greeted by a crowd of wives and concubines. The Chen family had always been favored across generations, and Chen Mufeng held a respectable position within the clan, so it was natural that he had many wives and concubines. Their chirping voices overlapped, but his face was dark as he waved them aside. He hurried inside, going straight to the innermost part of the courtyard, where he found a woman seated quietly. She did not have a particularly remarkable appearance, yet Chen Mufeng greeted her with a beaming smile. He approached attentively and spoke softly, "Dear." Madame Li, the younger sister of Li Zicheng, was sipping tea in the courtyard. A young boy of 12 or 13, with narrow eyes and gentle brows, stood beside her with his hands behind his back. Madame Li acknowledged her husband and replied, "You've returned just in time. Yonger has broken through to the 4th stage of the embryonic breathing realm. We were just about to go find you." Chen Mufeng was both shocked and delighted. What? When he ran his spiritual sense over his eldest son, he found that Chen Yang had broken through to the 4th stage of the embryonic breathing realm. Chen Mufeng exclaimed in awe, "Even though this cultivation speed can't compare to Li Ziming in his youth, it should be able to rival the current overseer of Mount Qingdu." Madame Li smiled and nodded. Chen Yang raised his brows and looked at his father, speaking softly, "The technique of the embryonic breathing realm is too crude. Otherwise, I could be even faster." He had inherited his mother's gray-black eyes, while his gentle and elongated brows resembled those of his maternal uncle's line. If one were to compare closely, he looked more like a member of the Li family than the Chen family. Chen Mufeng's heart skipped a beat whenever his son narrowed his eyes. Chen Mufeng's fear of those eyes had kept him from growing particularly close to his child. There had been times where he had seen the Li family's cunning and suspicion in the boy's unintentional movements or expressions. However, compared to his other children, who were like a flock of quails, Chen Yang's talent was simply unmatched. Chen Mufeng would rather choose Chen Yang than one of those incompetent and useless kids. On the other hand, Madame Li adored her child. Her gaze was gentle as she said, "The reason I wanted to talk is because I want Yonger to serve the heir." Chen Yang did not lift his head, but his narrow eyes swiftly and subtly flicked up as he scanned his father's face. His gray-black pupils contracted slightly, and the dark center fixed itself in an unblinking stare. "Ah," Chen Mufeng responded. When he looked at Chen Yang, he saw a compliant expression on the boy's face. He then continued, "It is naturally a good thing. I only worry about Qingliao." "I've already spoken to him," replied Madame Li. She returned her gaze to her tea and dismissed Chen Yang. Her expression grew serious and anxious as she said, "Can you not see it in Yonger? He is not destined to remain in a shallow pond. The reason I rarely let him meet my elder brother is precisely because of his nature. He's like, I don't even know who he resembles. His cunning and ambition grows by the day. If he cannot gain the trust of the Li family early on, I fear he will not meet a good end." "What?" Chen Mufeng jerked his head up in disbelief. He had once been a young man with ambitions himself, so he felt his wife was exaggerating. He spoke softly, "Why go so far, madam? A child in his teens will naturally have a little ambition. It will fade with time." "You don't believe me?" asked Madame Li. Chen Mufeng immediately held his tongue and nodded. "I'll take him to see Qingliao right away." Madame Li grabbed his hand. "I've heard that the heir is no easy character either. When you go, you must personally accompany Yonger to meet him, just in case anything happens." Chen Mufeng felt like his wife was overthinking things but still nodded again. He hurried out of the courtyard, bringing Chen Yang with him. They rode the wind all the way to the grand side hall, where they waited for about an hour until Li Qingliao finally returned. The two wove through the corridors between the pavilions. This was Chen Yang's first time here. His eyes widened and his heart trembled when he saw the golden rooftops and the white jade steps on the terraces. Li Qingliao was returning from patrolling their territory with his men. The friction of their armor produced audible clang as they walked. Chen Yang knelt alongside his father at the bottom of the steps. The boy quietly scanned the 18 stone steps leading to the top of the hall. His heart trembled as he thought, what magnificent power. Thoughts flickered lightly in his mind as he peeked at the man in the wolf fur cloak above. Li Qingliao did not exert much pressure, yet he exuded authority simply by standing above them. A surge of audacity rose in Chen Yang's heart. A true man should stand above tens of thousands and overpower all heroes with his cultivation. He should manipulate heaven and earth with his schemes. If one merely follows instructions and cultivates without question, what is the purpose of cultivation? Chapter 664, Chen Yang II. Li Qingliao wore a gentle smile as he replied to Su Gongming, "The weather has eased a little, so we've finally gotten a harvest. That's a relief." He took the family head's seat as he looked at Chen Mufeng and Chen Yang below him and said warmly, "This must be Yonger. I've heard you've broken through to the 4th stage of the embryonic breathing realm. What a rare talent." The 18 steps in the hall were not mere decorations. They perfectly blocked the spiritual sense of ordinary cultivators of the Qi cultivation realm. More than that, Chen Yang was kneeling far away, ruling out the possibility that Li Qinglao had probed him with spiritual sense. I've only just come out of seclusion, yet he already knew. Li Qinglao descended the steps with a cheerful smile until he stood before the youth. He lifted Chen Yang's hand, saw the boy raise his head and gave a slight nod. Turning back to Su Gongming and the others, he laughed. "One look and you can tell he's one of ours. His brows and eyes are exactly the same." This statement clearly caught everyone off guard. Chen Yang was stunned for a moment, and his lips involuntarily curled slightly downward. But then his brows lifted, and his eyes shone with both joy and pride. His calm face suddenly came to life, bursting forth with a surge of spirit. The crowd laughed heartily, offering their congratulations. However, Li Qinglao felt a shadow of doubt flash across his mind even as he smiled. That expression. Good. That rebellious and ambitious aura brought back memories like a thorn pricking his hand, making him grit his teeth and inhale sharply. Li Qinglao's smile twisted slightly as he remembered a youth who had once wielded gray fire and rampaged across the sky. He's a seed of ambition. Li Qinglao had always trusted his instincts. Just as he had once recognized Su Zhao's uniqueness at a glance, he now sensed the same budding ambition in Chen Yang. Yet this was not blind arrogance. This boy carried more of the Li family's cunning and even a hint of cruelty. And his talent is exceptional. If he is set loose into the world, he could stir up great storms. The Chen family has produced a true prodigy. Having made a preliminary judgment on the boy's character, Li Qinglao smiled at Chen Yufeng and asked, "So you plan to send him to accompany the heir? If he's so remarkably talented, wouldn't it be a waste not to allow him to solely focus on cultivation?" While his eyes were fixed on Chen Yufeng, his spiritual sense was focused on Chen Yang. He noticed the boy's head rise slightly and the twitch of his eyelids. Li Qinglao's heart stirred as he listened to Chen Yufeng's courteous reply. Chen Yufeng replied, "Embryonic breathing realm doesn't require daily cultivation. It only takes a few hours a day for him to refine spiritual qi. The rest of the time is often wasted effort. It's better for him to learn something at the heir's side. After all, Yang is 3 years older than the heir. He can guide Zhao Wei a little." Li Qinglao replied politely, though he had already agreed in his heart. He turned to the boy and deliberately said, "Yang, follow the corridor down. Someone will lead you to the heir's residence. I've already informed him that I'm sending over a companion." Chen Yufeng was slightly stunned when he realized that Li Qinglao intended to have the two children meet alone. However, just as he stepped hesitantly toward his son, Li Qinglao smiled and added, "I still have a few matters to discuss with the battalion commander." Chen Yufeng could only come to a halt upon hearing these words. Recalling his wife's words, he could only sigh lightly as he watched his child leave. Li Qinglao said, "I recall that the Chen family has been at odds with the Su family for generations. Has there ever been a marriage alliance between the two families?" "Of course not." Chen Yufeng answered firmly. Chen Yang hesitated for a moment, and then thought that Li Qinglao did not wish for him to hear the following conversation. He quickly followed the guard down the corridor, passing through the winding walkway until he reached the courtyard's outer edge. When he glanced around at the pristine white ground and the two slightly ajar golden doors at the entrance, a trace of disdain flickered in his heart. Chen Yang had always been the most talented among his peers since he was a child. He toyed with them like playthings, manipulating them with just a few words. "How could I possibly fear another child?" he thought to himself. "What of the heir? His talent is likely mediocre. I heard he's only been cultivating for 2 years. At best, he has condensed radiant lure chakra and reached the second stage of the embryonic breathing realm. That would be nothing for me to handle. Besides, what schemes could he possibly have when he's been confined to this small courtyard every day? I only need a small trick to wrap him around my finger." Chen Yang had always been cunning. How could he respect a child 3 or 4 years younger than him? He sneered inwardly as he mused that the heir likely could not even recognize all his characters yet. As he stepped into the courtyard, a sudden, intoxicating fragrance filled his nostrils. Chen Yang frowned, but he was too young to recognize the scent. He thought to himself, "I don't know what kind of incense this is, but it smells good. I should take some back later." An old ape with white fur and drooping eyelids stood in the inner courtyard. Chen Yang was too sharp to underestimate such a creature. He thought to himself, "This is most likely the spirit beast that guards the heir. I wonder what level its cultivation has reached." Since he could only guess that it was likely a spirit beast at the Qi cultivation realm, he respectfully bowed before entering. He felt pleased with himself, believing he had discreetly earned some favor. When he pushed open the door, Chen Yang saw a boy dressed in gold and white, kneeling in the courtyard. He seemed to be only 8 or 9 years old and was facing away from him. Before Chen Yang could greet him, the heir suddenly turned around. A pair of deep dark golden eyes locked onto him. They were calm yet filled with a disdainful scrutiny. The heir's ears perked up slightly and twisted agilely to his feet as he noticed something off. For a moment, the way he moved resembled the supple yet strong movements of a leopard on the prowl. Startled, Chen Yang instinctively took a step back, but a moment later, he swiftly buried his embarrassed anger as he said quietly, "Greetings to the heir of the Li family." Li Xiaowei examined him for 2 breaths. His amber eyes seemed to become even more fearsome and sinister at Chen Yang's tone. Chen Yang's instincts prickled as he realized he quickly sensed the meaning in his gaze. He quickly realized, those are not ordinary eyes. Normal people would never even dare look at them unless they were kneeling before him. In fact, those eyes might be more effective against women. He stifled a wave of anger at being belittled. He sneered inwardly as he stepped forward, emphasizing his taller and stronger frame, and pretended to humbly say, "Greetings." Chapter 665, Fight I. Chen Yang spoke these words while imagining all the possible reactions from the boy in front of him. However, he was confident that he had said nothing wrong. Thinking that his cultivation was superior, he merely lowered his head slightly and made a humble gesture. "I'm not breaking the rules. What can you do about it?" Chen Yang thought to himself, yet he received no reply for a long time. His gaze soon landed on Li Xiaowei's face. His dark pupils shifted towards the boy's narrow eyes, revealing a somber look of scrutiny. He neither bowed nor saluted, even carrying a slightly condescending air. As his gaze met the eyes of the heir before him, his mind suddenly went blank. All the sinister arrogance in his heart seemed to be laid bare. He muttered inwardly, "I'm in trouble." In an instant, Li Xiaowei suddenly stepped forward. Chen Yang only felt a tightness in his throat as a pair of hands, swift as lightning, shot up along his neck and clamped down on his throat. "You!" exclaimed Chen Yang. He had never expected Li Xiaowei to erupt so suddenly, yet the boy pounced like a ferocious beast with overwhelming force. In an instant, Chen Yang lost his balance and fell to the ground with a heavy thud. Bang! Chen Yang's head slammed hard against the stone floor, so hard that stars burst before his eyes. The impact was anything but light. If not for his cultivation at the 4th stage of the embryonic breathing realm, he would have likely lost consciousness from the blow. Chen Yang could hardly breathe and panic surged in his heart as his casting posture was restricted. However, he was no ordinary person. He quickly came up with a countermeasure and began prying off Li Xiaowei's hand. "His cultivation is much lower than mine. As long as I activate my mana, I can immediately turn the tables on him." Just as this thought arose, Li Xiaowei decisively released his grip. Freeing his hands, he grabbed the inkstone from the table and smashed it onto Chen Yang's forehead without hesitation. As the black ink splattered, a red-black bruise immediately spread across his forehead and his eyebrows twitched in fury. "To hell with you," said Chen Yang. The strike made Chen Yang's hands loosen their grip. However, with his cultivation at the 4th stage of the embryonic breathing realm, he only felt momentarily dizzy before quickly regaining clarity. His suppressed contempt and rage finally broke free. He grabbed onto Li Xiaowei's clothing, attempting to pull him up. Chen Yang was no ordinary child. The Chen family had accumulated many sword arts and techniques over the past 100 years. While their techniques at the Qi cultivation and foundation establishment realm could not compare to the direct descendants of the Li family, their techniques at the embryonic breathing realm were certainly formidable. An azure glow had already begun to flicker in Chen Yang's hands. Clang. But once again, Li Xiaowei caught him off guard. A chilling clang of cold iron rang out as the table was kicked over. Li Xiaowei had already drawn the long halberd hidden beneath it. The azure glow in Chen Yang's hands froze midair. The gleaming tip of the halberd was pressed directly against his throat. The frigid metal sent a chill through his body, making his hair stand on end. His seething rage quickly dissipated and was swallowed back down. Damn it, who the hell keeps a halberd under a table? It's not even a personal sword. Is he constantly on guard against assassins or what? But there was no time to dwell on it. A sharp pain pricked his throat, forcing Chen Yang to step back slowly. His eyes met those dark golden irises that were utterly devoid of emotion. For a moment, the only sound in the courtyard was the slow scuffing of their boots against the ground. Li Xiaowei remained silent, his gaze calm as he steadily forced Chen Yang into a corner. Only then did he finally speak his first words, "Do not look at me with those eyes." Chen Yang hesitated for a moment before instinctively smoothing his expression. In an instant, all traces of cunning, contempt, and calculated judgment vanished without a trace. But he suddenly felt Li Xiaowei's grip tighten further. The halberd pressed forward with force. Chen Yang's mind reeled in disbelief as he screamed internally, "Is he insane?" Thud. The halberd plunged viciously into the wooden wall behind him. Fear crashed through Chen Yang like a landslide. Cold sweat dripped down his face, his legs giving out beneath him as he collapsed to his knees. He lowered his head, only for the man before him to lift his chin once more. He was forced to meet those dark golden eyes. Within them, strange ring-like shapes expanded and contracted, like black halos sinking and rising in molten gold. Only when Li Xiaowei saw the terror he desired in Chen Yang's eyes did he finally release his grip. Chen Yang slumped weakly before him, barely managing to prop himself up. Through his blurry vision, he vaguely made out 3 figures standing silently at the entrance of the courtyard. One was clad in dark golden armor, broad-shouldered and imposing. Another was dressed in flowing white robes with a sword strapped to his back. Neither of them spoke, they simply watched in silence. Only an old man hurried forward, setting the overturned table upright as he asked, "What happened here?" Chen Yang's blood, mixed with ink, dripped slowly from Li Xiaowei's forearm. The boy clasped his hands and replied, "Sir, it was nothing more than playful roughhousing." Li Xuanxuan sighed, waved his hand, and called for the white ape waiting outside the courtyard. He spoke in a low voice, "Take him away and use the meditation spell to calm him. The child has been frightened, he will need time to recover." Chen Yang was lifted and carried out of the courtyard by the white ape. Li Xuanxuan frowned at the mess before casually casting a few spells. Using mana, he restored the disordered objects to their proper places before finally sitting down. Once Li Xuanfeng had taken his seat, Li Zijun, with a faint smile on his lips, also sat down and began brewing tea. He spoke softly, "This Chen family boy is rather interesting." Li Xuanfeng merely observed Li Xiaowei carefully and said casually, "He has a fierce look." Li Xuanxuan remained silent, but Li Zijun showed no sign of concern. He chuckled and said, "He's more cunning than cautious, talented but arrogant, and unwilling to succumb to others. Though his innate ability is extraordinary enough to carve out a legacy in this era, his arrogance will be his downfall sooner or later." As Li Zijun spoke, Li Xuanxuan gave a slight nod. Meanwhile, Li Xiaowei, sitting quietly to the side, blinked. Seemed to understand the underlying message and silently accepted it. One can only hope that setbacks will teach him to change. Li Xuanfeng shifted his cup and said in a low voice, "People like him don't change. Just like Jianixi back then, sharp in all matters, undefeated in every battle. But when the moment of reckoning came, he still met his end." Li Xuanxuan pondered for a long while before finally speaking, his voice soft. "Only our heir can keep this Chen family boy in check." Li Xuanxuan's words eased the concerns of the others. He smiled, gently patting Li Xiaowei as he spoke. "In less than 2 years, you've already condensed the radiant lure chakra and reached the second stage of the embryonic breathing realm." Li Xuanfeng had been carefully observing him for a long while before finally saying, "I've been traveling between the southern border and the eastern sea these past days, paying close attention to various matters. Let me explain them to you clearly." He paused for a moment before continuing in a low voice. "First is the matter of Bright Yang. In the past, the Bright Yang Dao lineage was rare, with only a few remaining inheritors on a few offshore islands. But due to the Eastern Fire incident, Bright Yang Foundation Establishment Realm Cultivators has now emerged both inland and overseas. It is gradually becoming known to more people. This Foundation Establishment Realm is highly beneficial for descendants, yet cultivators who practice it tend to grow increasingly fierce in temperament. They were either becoming more domineering or more stubborn, due to the influence of the immortal Foundation Realm." Li Zijun frowned slightly, recalling Li Ziming from the mountain. Li Xuanfeng continued saying, "In the balance of yin and yang, Bright Yang corresponds to veiled yin. Dao lineages complement and counteract each other. You must be mindful of this. In the northwest, Wu State borders the Western Sea with a region known as Zhejiang. There lies the Chen State, also called the Kingdom of Daughters, where cultivation follows the path of veiled yin. Though they rarely interact with the outside world nowadays, one must remain vigilant." Chapter 666, Fight II. Li Xuanfeng gave his warnings, and Li Zijun nodded silently. The elder casually mentioned some recent affairs, prompting the ever-perceptive Li Zijun to ask about the matter concerning Sidu Chen from the Golden Tang Gate. Li Xuanfeng's expression remained unchanged as he denied it outright, saying, "It has nothing to do with me." The white-robed youth nodded thoughtfully. Meanwhile, Li Xuanfeng pulled Li Xiaowei closer and asked, "Wire, Bright Yang is a path of dominion over others. It is said to aid cultivation. Going forward, you must oversee the matters of the family as well." "Xiaowei understands," responded Li Xiaowei. Li Xiaowei nodded. Finally unable to contain himself, Li Zijun asked, "Why is it that Brother Ming cultivates the Bright Yang, yet his case differs from so many descriptions?" Li Zijun recounted everything about Li Ziming's situation from beginning to end. Li Xuanfeng stroked his beard and said softly, "I don't believe Ziming was ever suited for radiant lure cultivation. Radiant lure is a worldly path. People like Zicheng and Qingliao can cultivate it well, but he should have studied the Dao lineages like 12 Essences or Jade True Unified Void Essence instead. Right now, his mindset does not align with his Dao lineage. He's going against his own heart, and that makes it meaningless. So that's how it is," exclaimed Li Zijun. Li Zijun felt his hands go numb. He absent-mindedly set the jade teapot on the table, suddenly recalling a moonlit night when Li Ziming seemed to have foreseen something. Back then, he had lightly placed the Golden Yang Radiant Origin Qi in Li Zijun's hands, proposing to trade cultivation techniques. A burning pain welled up in the young man's heart. He said with a low and heavy voice, We never truly understood. We only wanted to leave him the best things." Li Xunfeng caught the blame in his elder brother's gaze and responded softly, I shouldn't have spoken, but our family's radiant essence scripture is of the highest grade. Ziming has never been at a disadvantage. Even if he had chosen for himself, he would have picked the higher-tier scripture for the sake of his own Dao. Li Xunfeng was unaware that Li Zijun and Li Ziming had considered exchanging their cultivation techniques during their younger years, but Li Zijun remembered it vividly. Though his expression quickly returned to calm, deep inside he mourned in this matter, and in others, I have failed brother Ming. Li Xunfeng did not linger. After a brief exchange, he rose, retrieved his bow, and said to the others, I'll take my leave now. I'll return home for a visit in a few years. Li Zijun and Li Xuanxuan walked him out together. Li Xuanxuan remained in relatively good spirits, failing to notice the storm of emotions hidden beneath the composed exteriors of his grandnephew and younger brother. Beneath their silence lay a tide of sorrow. Dafu Mountain, Song family's territory. The Song family's territory lay south of Mushroom Forest Plain and north of Helen Prefecture. Neither too large nor too small, it was an old and established family. However, their current landholding no longer matched their strength, especially after the fall of their last cultivator at the Foundation Establishment realm. A family at the Qi cultivation realm had no business holding such a territory. It was only because the Song family had once produced a female cultivator who was willing to become a concubine for a disciple from an immortal sect who had descended from Mount Azure Pond. That disciple later became the sect master of Azure Pond sect. As for the woman from the Song family, she benefited from his resources and successfully broke through to Foundation Establishment realm, propelling the Song family to prominence. Unexpectedly, this disciple, named Kai Wei, later advanced to the Purple Mansion realm, and his fortune became boundless. Though the woman from the Song family remained a mere concubine, her status was enough to secure the Song family's prosperity for a century. Such a pity that their descendants are so unworthy, falling to this state. Yuan Hudu stood silently amidst the deafening sound of gongs and drums. Compared to Yuan Haiyuan, he appeared much younger, with deep-set eyes and a higher nose giving him a more sinister look. Below, the courtyard bustled with laughter and greetings, yet no one dared to approach him. Only the head of the Song family stood behind him, wearing a fawning smile and uttering some empty pleasantries. Yuan Faiao, dressed in red ceremonial robes, stood in the courtyard with a beaming smile. His childhood sweetheart, veiled, awaited in the rear courtyard. He was undoubtedly in high spirits, having claimed both wealth and beauty. His face was flushed, brimming with satisfaction. Yuan Hudu, however, merely narrowed his eyes and silently observed the courtyard. Soon, he noticed an elderly man clad in black golden armor standing at the very edge. The elderly man was watching the scene coldly with his arms crossed. Without using spiritual sense to probe, Yuan Hudu instinctively sensed that this man was no ordinary figure. He quickly summoned someone and spoke in a low voice, Go find out. Who in the Li family has white hair and wears golden armor? Yuan Hudu could vaguely guess who he was. 9 times out of 10, he was someone from the Li family. Yet he felt no fear. In fact, he had anticipated this moment for some time. You really held back well. I've been wandering outside day after day, and finally you've come. Yuan Hudu thought to himself, if it had been him, he would never have endured this long. He knew the Li family would come sooner or later, and he had been waiting for their arrival. A mere broken engagement, surely they won't kill me over it. At most, I'll be scolded. Better yet that we end up fighting, maybe I can even get myself injured. The more strained the relationship between their two families became, the clearer the message would be to the Kai family. And since his life wouldn't be truly at risk, Yuan Hudu was quite content with this outcome, just as long as it's not him, even if it's Li Qinghang. But please not that fiend. When his subordinate came up and whispered a few words to him, Yuan Hudu's expression instantly soured. He murmured, it really is him. Golden bowstring Li Xunfeng. Since childhood, Yuan Hudu had never been groomed to be the family head, nor did he possess the extraordinary talent of Yuan Chengdun. He had spent most of his life just struggling to reach the Foundation Establishment realm. How could he not be afraid? His talent was mediocre and he lacked skill in combat arts. His breakthrough had relied on medicinal pills, and even among the family cultivators, he was only considered mid-tier. How could he possibly contend with Li Xunfeng? Even if Li Qinghang had come instead, he would have likely taken his life within 100 moves. Yuan Hudu took a deep breath and focused his gaze, only to realize that those commanding, imposing eyes were already staring straight at him. Damn it. Yuan Hudu forced a stiff, uneasy smile. His hand clenched tightly around his sleeve, hidden from view. He had long heard that this ruthless man feared nothing, and now suspicion and dread clawed at his heart. Finally, he saw the man step forward, moving steadily closer through the bustling, laughing crowd. The people instinctively parted, unconsciously forming a narrow path for him to advance. To Yuan Hudu's ears, all other sounds seemed to fade away, leaving only the cold, measured footsteps of those black golden boots against the ground. He He fought the overwhelming urge to flee and forced himself to stand his ground calmly. Li Xunfeng walked up to him without stopping, closing the distance until Yuan Hudu could see every detail of the intricate patterns on his black gold spirit armor. Only then did Li Xunfeng tilt his head slightly and quietly speak, "Yuan Hudu." That cold voice cut through the noisy crowd with eerie clarity, sending a chill down Yuan Hudu's spine. It made cold sweat break out all over his body. Chapter 667, The Power of a Single Arrow. Yuan Hudu suppressed the panic in his heart, and his mind went blank for a moment. After weighing the pros and cons, he immediately cupped his hands and said in a loud voice, "Yuan Hudu greets the general." Yuan Hudu feared that Li Xunfeng would silently kill him and leave, so his voice instantly drowned out all the noise in the courtyard. Those drinking paused mid-cup, and those offering congratulations fell silent. Everyone's eyes turned toward the stage and started whispering among themselves. Who is this? Has he come to offer congratulations? How could he receive such respectful treatment from Yuan Hudu? He is a Foundation establishment cultivator. I'm afraid he comes with ill intent. As everyone's gaze shifted over, Li Xunfeng simply stood with his arms crossed and his eyes gradually sharpened. His posture was straight, and his broad shoulders blocked out the light in front of Yuan Hudu completely. His voice was low and his tone was steady as he said, "I do not deserve the title of general from the head of the Yuan family. I am merely serving in the southern border. Upon hearing that a child from my family has suffered grievances, I came to ask the head of the Yuan family about it." Though his voice was not loud, the courtyard had already fallen silent enough to hear a pin drop. The cultivators with their keen senses heard every word clearly. They exchanged glances, lowered their heads and harbored different thoughts. Some were sneering, some were shocked, and some were worried for both families, but most of them simply reveled in the spectacle and watched coldly. So he is from the Li family. Li Xunfeng's name was well known. Built on his record of slaying demons and men alike, as well as the stories spread by the direct disciples of the seven sects who had encountered him in Grotto Heavens and overseas. He rarely acted within the mainland, so most people did not recognize his appearance or attire. But as soon as Li Xunfeng mentioned the southern border and the title of general, everyone immediately realized who he was and thought to themselves in unison, "It is the golden bowstring, Li Xunfeng." The divine bow of the southern border. Yuan Fai's face turned pale as he silently retreated into the crowd. He had long heard the rumors of an annulled engagement between the two families, but what could he do? Yuan Hudu had repeatedly assured him there was no need to worry, yet he found himself more confused than ever as he looked at the elderly man in black golden armor standing above. Sweat appeared on Yuan Hudu's forehead, as his very life was at stake now. He could no longer afford to speak harshly, but if he yielded, he would have offended not only the Li family but also the Kai family. The entire act he had staged would be for nothing. Left with no choice, he exhaled deeply and remained silent. Seeing Yuan Hudu's silence, Li Xunfeng spoke softly, "Your esteemed family fabricated momentum and humiliated my family for no reason. Out of respect for our past ties, my elder brother wished to avoid further conflict and spare our predecessors from disgrace. But I do not have such magnanimity. This matter cannot simply be let go." Yuan Hudu barely managed to meet his gaze and saw the sharpness in the old general's eyes. The eyes were piercing and full of warning, yet held little anger, as if to say, "All right, if you want to show the Kai family where you stand, I'll make sure they see it clearly." Yuan Hudu understood that this matter could not be settled peacefully. Recalling his elder brother Yuan Haiyuan's warning, he let out a slow sigh and replied, "What does the general intend to do?" Li Xunfeng lightly brushed the black golden beast head ornament at his waist, and a large bow appeared in his hand. Yuan Hudu's eyelids twitched at the sight. The people below the platform instinctively shrank back, taking a collective step backward. It was simply because the longbow was too terrifying. The golden bow measured around 8 kai in length, with limbs around 3 kai and 5 kun long. It shimmered in golden and crimson hues, radiating an intense aura. It was as if the energy of countless slain men and monsters surged within it, making it an unmistakable weapon of death. The cultivators below slowly backed away, finally grasping the terror hidden behind Yuan Hudu's sweat-drenched face. Hearing a name was never the same as witnessing its power firsthand. With a fight between Foundation establishment cultivators on the verge of breaking out, some took their leave, cupping their hands in farewell. However, most could not suppress their curiosity and chose to stay and watch in silence. The head of the Song family cautiously moved away in fear, as he was merely at the late stage of qi cultivation. Li Xunfeng, however, only fixed his gaze on Yuan Hudu as he rasped, "I offer the family head 2 choices." He slowly leveled the longbow, and the quiver at his waist let out a crisp metallic clang. He said, "I understand that the family head is cautious, always traveling with cultivators for protection. You may try and see whether the Foundation establishment cultivator and the demon hiding in the mountains can keep you safe together." But once this profound arrow is loosed, it will undoubtedly draw blood. Yuan Hudu never expected that Li Xunfeng had already seen through his preparations so clearly. Fear crept into his heart as the metallic objects in the courtyard began to tremble and rattle. Watching him drenched in sweat, Li Xunfeng continued, "Second, out of respect for the bond between your esteemed family and my granduncle, I'll give you the time of 20 breaths to prepare and take just one shot of an arrow from me. After that, all grievances between our families will be settled, and the matter will be put to rest." Yuan Hudu secretly exhaled, realizing that Li Xunfeng was ultimately sparing his life. This arrow was likely meant as a display for the Kai family. He thought to himself, "Li Xunfeng, no matter how formidable you are, can the power of just one arrow truly be so overwhelming?" But even though he understood the limits of his opponent's intentions, he did not dare provoke him further. Instead, he cupped his hands and replied, "Please, General, release your arrow." Seeing Li Xunfeng nod, Yuan Hudu wasted no time in riding the wind into the sky. 2 talismans burned rapidly within his sleeves, streaking away like comets. The 2 protective shields on his body shimmered brilliantly, appearing exceptionally sturdy. Li Xunfeng mirrored his movement, drawing his bow and nocking an arrow. A golden-red spirit arrow leaped from the quiver, and golden light burst forth from the longbow, illuminating the surroundings. The polished stone tiles on the ground gleamed, reflecting a hazy golden glow. Buzz, buzz. Everyone felt as if their faces were being slashed by blades. The fine wine and delicacies on the tables trembled violently, creating a chorus of clinking sounds. The golden brilliance flowing across Li Xunfeng's armor grew even more intense as he slowly ascended into the sky. The arrow on his longbow was the very same one that was refined through the 6-ding merging fire token and the binding ring. Now meticulously reforged and inscribed with intricate array patterns, it radiated dazzling brilliance, unleashing streams of astral chi. After precisely counting to 20 breaths, the cultivators in the courtyard had already retreated beyond its perimeter. Li Xunfeng released his fingers. Buzz, boom. The jade cups and jade wine jugs on the tables exploded with a loud crack, sending shards and gleaming wine splattering through the air like a rainstorm. The courtyard was swept by a violent gust, toppling tables and chairs into complete disarray. The falling debris forced the spectators to raise their sleeves in defense, but their spiritual senses had long since locked onto the golden bow. Yet, at that moment, they all felt an eerie void within their senses. They were unable to grasp anything at all through their spiritual senses. So fast, the golden arrow had already vanished without a trace. With no other choice, the crowd turned their eyes toward the distant sky, where a dark figure plummeted like a bird with broken wings. Realizing that Li Xunfeng had disappeared from sight, they exchanged uneasy glances. Li Xunfeng had not been arrogant. His profound arrow was no ordinary projectile. Even if it wasn't paired with his golden bow, it remained a true Foundation Establishment Dharma artifact. Having undergone refinement through merging fire, the profound arrow could retain astral chi for long periods and be precharged with golden astral chi. Since Yuan Hudu's immortal foundation, cultivation method, and realm were all inferior to his, Li Xunfeng was confident that this single arrow would be enough to awe the spectators and wash away his past humiliation. With the arrow loosed, he naturally activated a spell, drifting eastward with the wind. Quick, save the family head. Everyone feared that Yuan Hudu might die on the spot. The head of the Song family, utterly terrified, hastily took to the skies. The crowd scattered like a storm, clearing away the clouds, vanishing entirely. Only Yuan Fiao and a few others remained in the courtyard, standing there in bewilderment. Chapter 668, The Power of a Single Arrow, II. Yuan Hudu soared through the wind. Though he doubted that Li Xunfeng's arrow would be too overwhelming, his cautious nature kept him on guard. He burned through 2 talismans in succession and retrieved a spirit shield from his storage pouch. Placing the earth-colored shield behind him, Yuan Hudu finally felt a trace of security. With a thought, he calculated, and there were still 11 breaths left. He thought to himself, the farther, the better. Drawing on his past experience, he surged forward in one breath but hesitated for just a moment, thinking to himself, after all, he is a direct descendant of the 3 sects. I must not be careless. Yuan Hudu went as far as to reverse his mana flow, causing a flush of red to appear on his face. His essence chi surged wildly as he used an escape spell that consumed his vital energy and blood essence. His figure flickered with layers of blood shadows as he sped. Suddenly, a piercing buzzing sound echoed in his ears, and 2 deep gashes split open on his cheeks. Before he could even react in shock, he felt a hollow sensation in his chest. Looking down, he saw nothing but an empty hole where his heart and lungs should have been. Only then did the sound of his shattered shield reach his ears. The earth-colored spirit shield had been blasted away, embedding itself deep into a distant cliffside. Yuan Hudu nearly lost consciousness in one breath, his eyes staring blankly at the sky as he coughed up misty bursts of blood. His unwavering willpower saved his life. He forcefully stabilized his cultivation. activating his immortal foundation, Origin Stabilization. It rapidly circulated, preserving his vitality and keeping him alive. He exhaled sharply, but the wind beneath his feet had already been shattered by the violent golden energy. Unable to divert mana to control his flight, he reached into his storage pouch and retrieved a round, rolling object. The spirit item was crimson red. It was neither entirely flesh nor earth, yet it writhed restlessly. Yuan Hudu stuffed it into the gaping hole in his chest. Only then did he regain the strength to steer the wind beneath his feet. But dizziness overtook him as streams of golden astral chi surged through his body. The wind beneath his feet formed and dissipated repeatedly, causing him to hover briefly in midair. He crashed through countless trees before finally plummeting to the ground with a heavy thud. He crashed through numerous trees and sent flocks of birds and beasts scattering in alarm. But regardless of everything, he still had the body of a Foundation Establishment cultivator. The brief pauses in midair had lessened the impact, preventing his injuries from worsening further. However, he was still gravely injured. Though the fall did not kill him outright, he lost consciousness and his breath was slowing to a near stop. Only then did the spirit shield, which had been buried in the mountain, finally break free and clatter to the ground beside him. The gathered cultivators halted their steps, landing one by one around Yuan Hudu. All were too stunned to speak as they sensed his faint, nearly extinguished. But before they could get a closer look, a streak of gray mist rushed into their midst, rapidly solidifying into human form. It scooped up the unconscious Yuan Hudu and vanished instantly. The gray mist, of course, was the Yuan family's guardian demon beast. It did not forget to sweep up the spirit shield from the ground. They then carefully erased all traces of blood from the dirt to prevent it from falling into others' hands, before disappearing swiftly beyond the horizon. The remaining cultivators exchanged glances before silently withdrawing. One of them glanced around and said with a sigh, "To think a single arrow could wield such power." The person beside him nodded in agreement, replying, "Who would have thought that after Li Qijing's disappearance, the Li family would still have such a powerful figure? And yet they dared to bully the orphan he left behind. Looking at how he's barely clinging to life, it's clear that he could be easily killed." He was spared only out of previous ties between the families. At Mount Qingdu, Chen Yang, Chen Mufeng, muttered Li Zijin. He sat at the desk, carefully recounting the earlier events. Seated across from him were two elderly men. The leading elder wore a wide-sleeved Taoist robe, listening attentively with a gentle expression. He was at the 9th stage of qi cultivation. The other elder, a one-armed man, seemed to possess only various unrefined qi. His expression was stern and his head was full of white hair. "Esteemed elders, that is the situation," said Li Zijin. After he finished speaking, the elder in the Taoist robe sighed with a nod and replied, "I understand." This man was Chen Dong. As time flowed like water, he had spent over a decade lingering at the qi cultivation stage. This old man was diligent and devoted, with no hobbies aside from occasionally sitting atop Mount Ziping. The other man was the eldest clan elder of the Li family, named Li Kegang. He had suffered injuries in the marketplace and had been burned by merging fire. Though he had been saved with great effort, his hair had withered, his eyes dimmed, and he could barely lift his hands. Yet the old man still nodded and said, "We will go to the Chen family immediately." One was Chen Mufeng's master, and the other an elder of the Chen family. Li Zijin naturally trusted them and said softly, "It is merely a mention, no need to dwell too much on it." Watching the two depart, Li Zijin finally settled back into his seat of authority. Beside him, Li Yuexiang blinked and murmured, "Brother, you seem to take this matter quite seriously." Li Qingliao, also standing to the side, appeared to have something to report but had yet to find an opening. Li Zijin sighed and said, "I can see that boy has the eyes of someone unwilling to concede. Though the heir can keep him under control, we as guardians of the house cannot simply let things be. Naturally, we must add a few more chains to be at ease. He doesn't seem to have much talent for the cultivation of radiant lure and celestial whirl. Perhaps it was all taken by Zhao Wei alone. If he has to hold everything up by himself, he will struggle to balance it all. If put to good use, Chen Yang's worth could rival that of dozens." Li Yuexiang nodded slightly, yet before she could speak, Li Zijin pondered for a moment, then solemnly gestured for both of them to come closer. He said, "Yuexiang, Qingliao, listen carefully." Li Yuexiang immediately focused her gaze, and Li Qingliao likewise looked over with a serious expression. Only then did Li Zijin speak softly. "Looking back at the past generations of our family heads, many have perished violently, fallen to curses and assassinations. How many have truly retired in peace? Even an ordinary family in town would not see such generations of sudden deaths. Anyone sitting in the highest seats of Qingdu and the central hall must always be prepared for the end of their path. I'll oversee matters in Qingdu. As for Qingliao, you govern the household in Lijiang. We must be cautious and nip dangers in the bud, but if the time ever comes when we must trade son for son." Li Zijin paused briefly before speaking gently. "Do not be stingy with your lives. More importantly, plan for the next 100 years." Both nodded in understanding. Li Zijin put away the wooden slip in his hand, while Li Qinglao stepped forward and respectfully reported, "Eighth uncle, Elder Xuanfeng appeared at the Song family wedding, saying that he would settle all grievances between the two families once and for all." With just one shot of an arrow, Elder Xuanfeng nearly obliterated Yuan Hudu's body and soul. He was left with only a single breath. He was barely kept alive by our Wanglin blossom before the Yuan family took him back. Li Zijin raised his eyebrows slightly at the news. He had expected Li Xuanfeng to go and threaten the Yuan family, but he hadn't imagined his overwhelming might to reach such an extent. Turning to Li Yuexiang, he said softly, "Little sister, the elder has avenged you." Chapter 669, Chen and Li I. Li Yuexiang listened to her brother's words, but there was no joy on her face. She had more concerns on her mind and simply murmured softly, "I don't feel wronged, but I fear that offending them too deeply may stir up trouble." Li Zijin gently shook his head and replied, "There is no longer any question of offense. All the noble families have their eyes set on profit, and the Yuan family has already lost its moral standing." Li Yuexiang nodded slightly. Meanwhile, Li Zijin unfolded the small letter in his hand and read through it, then said softly, "Go and make preparations. Brother Zijai will return in a few days to take you to Green Pine Island. His cave dwelling still has vacant spots. It will be beneficial for you to cultivate there." Only then did Li Yuexiang nodded lightly, revealing a trace of happiness. Li Zijin did not wish to say more, so he dismissed them. After listening to the reports from below, he smiled and left the hall. He made his way through the corridor and quickly arrived at the alchemy pavilion. Li Ziming, clad in a Taoist alchemist robe, sat leisurely in the hall. His garments were fresh and crisp, with a faint paleness to them. Having just broken through to the mid-stage of Foundation Establishment realm, he was basking in the triumph of success. Li Zijin knew him all too well. Though he appeared composed, he was undoubtedly overjoyed inside. Playing along, Li Zijin strode up quickly and exclaimed in surprise, "That was fast, Brother Ziming. Was it a smooth breakthrough?" Li Ziming chuckled happily, tightening his sleeve cuffs as he replied, "Since I took a medicinal pill, the breakthrough was effortless. I spent some time conditioning myself to stabilize my cultivation before coming out." He was brimming with excitement and was about to go into detail when he suddenly scanned Li Zijin up and down, his expression shifting to one of surprise and delight. He exclaimed, "You've reached the Foundation Establishment realm." Li Zijin allowed a small smile to surface and nodded slightly. Li Ziming immediately stood up and clapped him on the shoulder with a grin, saying, "What a fine snow pine mana." Li Ziming listened as Li Zijin relayed Li Xuanfeng's words, his brows knitting together in thought. He shook his head slightly and said with questions in his mind, "I don't see it that way. My cultivation in the Bright Yang path has progressed steadily. I have already surpassed some of the direct disciples of the immortal sects. How could I be deemed unfit? Perhaps the elder has grown too accustomed to the high standards of the southern border." He suddenly clenched his fist, belatedly realizing something and muttering, "If I had followed the family's arrangements back then, as the elder suggested, perhaps my cultivation wouldn't have progressed much slower after all." While Li Ziming mulled over his thoughts, Li Zijin caught sight of a potted orchid on the table from the corner of his eye. Despite being in seclusion for years, it was still flourishing. It indicated that someone had been tending to it carefully. His eyes flickered as he turned his head to the other side, gazing at the alchemy furnace. The flames inside flickered unpredictably, while the world outside was engulfed in a raging storm. Li Ziming, unaware of why Li Zijin's expression had changed, looked on in confusion. Li Zijin paused before suddenly asking, "Brother Ziming, have you taken a liking to orchids in recent years?" Li Ziming looked slightly embarrassed and quickly replied, "I just grow them for leisure. It has nothing to do with Zhuoyan." As soon as he said it, he realized he had spoken too quickly. But before he could adjust his tone, he saw Li Zijin suddenly frown, gazing at the storm outside and murmuring, "It's a celestial phenomenon." Li Ziming was still trying to form a response, but Li Zijin's words shut him down. In an instant, Li Zijin vanished. Li Ziming swiftly followed behind. He rode a streak of golden light, and soon stood beside Li Zijin atop Mount Qingdu. Both of them gazed into the southern horizon, where a golden radiance shone in the distance. Their immortal foundation's realm rippled gently, allowing them to faintly perceive the rising multicolored light in the distance. Li Ziming sighed enviously and said, "Someone must have broken through to the purple mansion." The iridescent hues spread swiftly, forming clouds that took the shape of beasts and birds across the sky. They were so lifelike they seemed almost real. At the heart of the vast ocean of clouds, a massive celestial elephant formed from pure white mist trumpeted toward the heavens, radiating golden light in all directions. The golden radiance rippled outward like waves, causing the vegetation in the mountains to sway gently. Leaves fell like a golden rain, covering the entire mountain in autumn hues. Li Zijin slowly closed his eyes, carefully attuning himself to the rising spiritual energy permeating the heavens and earth. Li Ziming also paused, realizing what was happening. Both brothers closed their eyes and immersed themselves in the moment. After about 15 minutes, they exchanged a glance, and Li Ziming said with a sigh, "The profound balance atmosphere. It has already dissipated completely." It's rare for it to last this long. Li Zijian carefully observed the direction where the clouds were converging and estimated that it was within the Hangzhou Dao Gate. He murmured, "Hangzhou Dao Gate has gained another purple mansion realm cultivator." The two brothers rode the wind back down to the mountain together. Li Ziming said, "I clearly remember that Hangzhou Dao Gate and Yue cultivating sect have always had a good relationship, but how can such a breakthrough be controlled at will?" A celestial phenomenon of this scale is like an announcement to the entire world, and this phenomenon might just be the final surge that drains the remaining spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Although the Li family had slowly built some foundation, they still lacked methods to detect phenomena like profound balance atmosphere and falling water rising storm, which were crucial to understanding the spiritual energy of cultivators at the Purple Mansion. For now, they could only watch helplessly, unsure of how the spiritual energy of heaven and earth had changed. "We lacked the necessary spells. If we hadn't anticipated a change and paid close attention, we might not have even noticed this subtle shift," said Li Zijian, sighing. Beside him, Li Ziming asked, "Why not have our aunt return for a while? If she uses her thunder techniques, she might be able to uncover some clues." "I don't think it'll be that simple," replied Li Zijian. He had discussed this matter with Li Qinghong before, and it seemed that falling water rising storm had only been perceivable in the past due to its connection to thunder techniques. Now it would likely be much harder to detect. He continued, "Just send a letter to Brother Zijai and ask him about it." Chapter 670, Chen and Li Ai. Chen Mufeng returned from the central hall to his residence, only to find that his wife, Madame Li, was sitting in the courtyard. Seated at the head of the hall were two elderly men. One of them wore a brown robe, with the empty sleeve of his severed arm appearing stark against the air. His hair was withered, his eyes sunken, and his entire being exuded the aura of someone nearing the end of their life. The other elder had a much steadier presence. A longsword rested on his back, and he wore a light gray robe. His posture was slightly hunched, as he leaned against a wooden chair. Chen Mufeng recognized these two faces all too well. Years ago, when he had been entrusted to Li Keqiang by old Master Chen, he had sat respectfully before these very same elders. Without hesitation, he immediately bowed deeply and said solemnly, "Mufeng greets Master and Elder." Li Keqiang's aged face remained heavy with contemplation. Once a farmer, he was now one of the highest-ranking elders in the clan, yet his expression remained unchanged from the past. He had once held the reins of the horses for Li Ziyangping and offered swords to Li Tongya, witnessing a century of trials and tribulations. Even though Chen Mufeng now far surpassed him in cultivation, he did not show the slightest impatience. He kept his head lowered in silence. Chen Dong also gazed at the man before him without speaking. The two elders sat in silence, yet their presence alone created a heavy atmosphere that made even Madame Li hold her tongue. Chen Mufeng's heart was uneasy, but then his elder, Chen Dong, waved his hand lightly and said in a soft voice, "This is good news. That boy Chen Yang's innate ability has caught the attention of Qingdu. You and your wife ought to be congratulated." As soon as these words were spoken, both of them let out a sigh of relief. Chen Mufeng cupped his hands and said with a smile, "Many thanks to the esteemed elders for your support." Chen Mufeng hurriedly sent someone to fetch him. The man before him, Li Keqiang, was not only his master but had also once been his father-in-law. Unfortunately, his daughter had passed away early, which led to his marriage with his current wife, Madame Li. Chen Dong waited in silence and spoke no words. When Chen Yang quietly stepped up from the front of the hall, he examined him closely and furrowed his brows. Li Keqiang, appearing as if his aged eyes were dim, squinted and stared at him for a long time, thinking to himself, "He has a bit of a fierce and cunning look, but those eyes, they remind me of Chen Erniu from back then." Both of them were the type to keep 12 layers of thoughts hidden in their stomachs. His eyes were grayish-black, and his eyebrows were longer than those of most Chen family members, the traits that were all too familiar. Li Keqiang had dealt with this type for nearly a century. It was unmistakably the characteristics of someone from the main Li family. "This child is quite interesting. He has inherited the cunning and intelligence of both the Li and Chen families without omission. No wonder Zijian asked me to take a closer look. He is indeed extraordinary," said Li Keqiang. He then paused for a moment before continuing, "Qingdu's intention is for this child to follow Dong in cultivation." These words instantly shocked the couple. They exchanged glances and saw joy reflected in each other's eyes. They had long harbored this idea. Chen Yang was the most talented child in the family and should have been placed under Chen Dong's tutelage for careful instruction. However, the Chen family had always maintained a clean reputation, never engaging in actions that might arouse suspicion. Moreover, Chen Dong never returned to the Chen family and held no attachment to past ties. So they had kept this thought buried deep within their hearts. After all, Chen Dong was at the late stage of qi cultivation, and among the outsiders in the family, his status was second to none. It was even said that he had learned the Li family's sword techniques. Chen Mufeng's joy was evident as he reached out to pull the child forward to express their gratitude, but Chen Dong interrupted and said, "You two shouldn't celebrate too soon. I've rejected the proposal." The atmosphere suddenly turned cold. Chen Yang's eyes flickered slightly, and he lifted his chin, frowning at the words. He felt a faint throbbing in his forehead once again, yet this subtle expression made the two elders seated above pause. A thought swiftly flashed through Chen Dong's mind. He has pride. Putting on the demeanor of a seasoned elder, Chen Dong spoke softly to Madame Li beside him. "I see that this child's heart is not entirely righteous. The main family has proposed this arrangement multiple times, but I have rejected it each time." As soon as these words were spoken, Madame Li understood the situation. She stepped forward, took the child's hand, and said solemnly, "Swear the profound scenery spiritual oath." In the presence of these two esteemed elders, the mother and son went through the motions. Chen Yang's expression remained as calm as still water as he repeated whatever his mother instructed him to. Li Keqiang tapped his smoking pipe, while Chen Dong silently observed the child's reaction. Then, stepping down from the steps, he took Chen Yang's hand and led him out of the hall. He walked all the way to the riverside and sat down with Chen Yang. He began recounting the history from Chen Erniu's flight to Lijiang to the current state of affairs. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Our Chen family only exists today because of the kindness that the Li family's ancestor has shown us. Generation after generation, we have been entrusted with great responsibilities. This is how we have come to our current standing. Unity benefits both families, but conflict would only bring pain to those who are related to us. You must not have any ill intentions." Chen Yang's expression seemed to soften slightly. He pursed his lips and after a brief pause murmured, "Younger understands. The main family's grace and authority are immense." When these words reached Chen Dong's ears, he could only interpret them as elder, younger understands. The main family has many cultivators at the Foundation establishment realm and even connections with the immortal sects in the Purple Mansion. "I won't do anything foolish." Chen Dong sighed, pulled him up, and said in a firm tone, "Beyond this hall lies Moongaze Lake. Our Chen family has always relied on the kindness of the main family. If you ever act against them in the future, let heaven bear witness. Your body and soul shall be destroyed." Chen Yang stared at him blankly, then glanced at the darkening night sky. He had no choice but to repeat the words as instructed. Chen Dong, now weary of the matter, waved his hand lightly and said in a low voice, "Go back now." The young man hesitated with every step, glancing back repeatedly at the man the entire Chen family revered and relied upon. Finally, he turned away and disappeared. Chen Dong remained by the lakeside for a while. Soon, Li Keqiang returned from the mountain with his report. The wind technique he used was weak and unstable, causing him to waver unsteadily in the air. Seeing this, Chen Dong quickly supported him, guiding him safely to the shore. Li Keqiang stroked his beard and said softly, "Thank you, Dong." There were few in the Li family who could address Chen Dong in such a manner. Chen Dong nodded silently in acknowledgement as Li Keqiang spoke softly. "This crippled body of mine was burned by merging fire. Whenever it rains or if it's windy, the pain is so excruciating that I cannot even speak. It feels as if I am being torn apart, my mana utterly depleted. Even now, I can barely control the wind to travel." Li Keqiang had long avoided meeting people, and despite Chen Dong's repeated attempts to visit, he had never been granted an audience. Now that they had finally met, it was clear that the past years of imbalanced wind and rain had not been kind to Li Keqiang. Unable to hold back, Chen Dong cursed angrily, "That wretched Su family brat. There is no need for that, Dong." Li Keqiang said in a low voice, "At our age, there is no longer any such thing as what is wretched or not. He was a once-in-a-generation talent who never committed any heinous crimes, yet he was killed because of me. The retribution should fall upon me instead." There was a deep sense of acceptance on his face, leaving Chen Dong at a loss for words. After a long silence, Li Keqiang looked at him deeply and finally said, "Since Jingshan's passing, 5 of your 7 souls have gone with her. There is no light left in your eyes. The younger generation might not notice it, but I know you. The Chen Dong I knew was never like this." Chen Dong found himself speechless once more. Li Keqiang, with his head bowed slightly, walked alongside him by the lakeside in the quiet night. After a long while, Chen Dong murmured, "I was by her side for over 60 years. She got used to it." Li Keqiang sighed lightly, his expression wavering with emotion, and in a hoarse voice he said, "Dong, why do this to yourself? Forget Xuanxuan, even I understand her to some extent. Habit, that's all it was. She was born without a spiritual orifice. She saw her entire life as suffering. How could she have ever truly loved anyone?" Chen Dong's usually unshaken expression finally wavered with intense emotion. In a soft voice he said, "In the end, this is my burden alone." Li Keqiang replied, "All I see is that you can't move on. You have over 100 years of life left. If you are just going to continue like this, a walking corpse, then you might as well have died with her back in Mount Yue." Chen Dong came to a slow stop in the dark, remaining silent. Familiar figure emerged in his mind. He had been with her from childhood to adulthood, from life to death, through marriage and raising a daughter. It seemed that everything had gone as he had wished. He had helped her fulfill her desires, tying up all loose ends. He himself had become lost in it. But there was one truth he had always known, one he had deliberately pushed to the back of his mind. Yet, like a shadow, it had never truly left him. It manifested in countless lingering thoughts. And now it finally took form. Li Jingxin had seemed grateful to him, had trusted him, had been willing to marry him and bear his child. But never, not even once, had she looked at him the way a wife looks at her husband. He had known all along. Even though she was a mortal, as fragile as tofu in his hand, she still resisted with unyielding, near ruthlessness against everything she did not love. Chapter 671, Things of Mount Wu-I. Li Zijian spent years in secluded cultivation, refining spell arts and consolidating his immortal foundation. When he finally emerged, Mount Yuding had been influenced by his immortal foundation, snow on pine. The snow that once only covered the mountain's summit had now spread downward, blanketing the entire mountain in frost and snow. By the time he emerged, the sun was shining, and the trees were flourishing. As expected, several letters that were all from Li Zijai had been sent to him. Before he could read them, he heard that Li Xuanfeng was already waiting at Mount Qingdu. Hurriedly riding the wind toward the meeting, he quickly pulled out 2 letters and read them carefully. One discussed the shifting patterns of spiritual energy, while the other described the increasing turmoil in the Eastern Sea. Direct descendants from Chunyi Dao Gate and island of Mount Qingdu have perished, and several members of the Guo family on Crimson Reef Island have also died suddenly. He only glanced at it briefly before tucking it into his sleeve and flying swiftly to the mountaintop. Second great uncle has been returning frequently. It seems the Ning family has loosened their grip, or perhaps they've assigned him a task, muttered Li Zijian. He had been keeping track of these matters. He was perceptive and noticed that each time Li Xuanfeng returned, he always seemed to be under repeated instructions. He probed for information, but dared not ask too much. Now passing through the deep blue heaven-guarding formation of 5 waters, he landed back on Mount Qingdu. Li Xuanfeng stood with arms crossed in the grand hall, with Li Qinglio standing below him. Li Zijian took one look and spoke in a firm voice. Ancestor, what is this? Li Xuanfeng had already advanced to the late stage of foundation establishment realm. His expression was no longer as deeply furrowed and heavy as before, but had become cold and rigid. His chest armor was covered in glistening white blade marks, and 2 pieces of his golden arm guard were shattered, revealing the gleaming silver interior. A deep scar now ran along the side of his face, stretching from his jaw to his collarbone. The wound was a crystalline blood-red hue. It was glistening under the sunlight, indicating it had only recently begun to heal. It was a gruesome sight. Li Xuanfeng had spent decades slaughtering demons in the southern border. In the past 10 years, he had also killed many people. His hands were drenched in blood. Though most were enemies or those deserving death, there were also innocent ones among them. Yet with no choice, he steeled himself and carried out the killings. Only a handful of families from that list had survived. The cunning and deceitful Zhao family had sealed their mountain early, while the arrogant scion from Crimson Reef Island had his head taken by someone else. Nearly everyone else had been killed by his hand. The jade talisman bound with densely packed storage pouches was now stacked within his Eastern Sea cave dwelling. Fortunately, this jade talisman was indeed extraordinary and the targets had been carefully selected. No one had discovered the truth and instead, conflicts among several families with Foundation Establishment Realm cultivators were provoked, leading to bloody feuds. In the end, my hands are stained with filthy blood. Thought Li Xuanfeng. Li Xuanfeng's temperament was different from his elder brother Li Xuanxuan's. The more bloodshed and enmity he faced, the more his resolve hardened like iron. His will was unyielding. The only time his will broke was when Li Tangye was killed. Now, the more he was tempered, the more unshakable he became. He was not one to wallow in self-pity. He remembered both his grudges and debts with clarity, to the point that any sense of self-righteousness or arrogance had been thoroughly stripped away. What remained was a somber and profound realization, which lurked a faint, menacing indifference that made him seem less refined. Seeing Li Xuanfeng's guarded demeanor, Li Zijian dared not press further. He only sensed that something about Li Xuanfeng had changed. Just then, Li Xuanfeng changed the topic and asked, "The Ning family has calculated it several times. After all this turmoil, Jiangnan is now a place of upper evil spirit storage, benefiting those cultivating earth virtue, devil cultivation, water mansion, and blood qi. It neither harms nor benefits our family, just something to be aware of." Li Zijian nodded, assuming that Li Zijai's letter had also mentioned this. Then he heard Li Xuanfeng continue, "He has gone out less these past 2 years. Zhao Wei is naturally talented, so he doesn't need to rush within his 60-year cultivation limit. Don't let him focus solely on cultivation day after day. He should observe the world and see bloodshed. Otherwise, he might grow up twisted, becoming nothing more than a reckless fighter." Li Zijian nodded. Just then, he saw Li Xuanfeng retrieve a jade slip from the beast head ornament on his belt and softly said, "I selected this halberd technique after much deliberation. It was acquired by exchanging treasures I found from an eastern sea cave dwelling with one of the forces there. The more it's practiced, the more domineering it becomes. It seems well suited for Zhao Wei. Deliver it to him." Li Zijian took it but hadn't yet examined it when someone below reported, "My lord, ancestor Fei Loya has come to visit." Li Qingliao, who had been listening attentively for a long time, seized this opportunity to interject. "Eighth uncle, this man has come multiple times. You were in seclusion the previous times, so we had to send him away. This cultivator from Mount Yue isn't known for his patience. He's starting to grow restless." Li Zijian finally recalled this person. This Foundation Establishment cultivator of Mount Yue had long hoped to gain favor with the Li family's Purple Mansion Realm cultivator. This person had been half-heartedly dealt with since Li Yunjiao's time. Now, after decades, this old Mount Yue cultivator had actually reached the late stage of Foundation Establishment. Li Zijian immediately turned to Li Xuanfeng and softly said, "This matter." Li Xuanfeng naturally understood. Currently, there was only one guy in the Li family that was backed by a Purple Mansion Realm cultivator. He nodded and said, "Let's go take a look." Li Zijian left Mount Qingdu and arrived at the hall. In the center, the Mount Yue cultivator stood with his hair disheveled and his hands behind his back. Despite wearing a Taoist robe, he had a fierce and menacing appearance and was standing coldly in the courtyard. Upon seeing Li Zijian, his expression eased slightly, and he spoke in a deep voice, "Are you the one in charge now?" Fei Loya's tone softened a little. He had met Li Tongya and Li Yunjiao before. Over the past century, the Li family had changed several elders, yet he had heard that all of them had died for their clan. Though he didn't fully understand it, he held a certain respect for them and asked, "Has your esteemed family made any progress on the promise you made me years ago? I can't stay by the lake any longer. I'll be leaving in the next few days." Li Zijian acknowledged his words first, then asked with some confusion, "Senior, why such a sudden decision?" Had he not asked, it would have been fine, but the question made Fei Loya glare at him and replied, "Zhu Xian is dead. He died so suddenly while he was out and his body wasn't even found." Zhu Xian was one of Fei Loya's subordinates. He was at the early stage of the Foundation Establishment realm. Back in the day, hooked serpent Li Wushao had yet to grow back his twin-hooked tail, and his strength was similar to Zhu Xian's. Though considered weak among Foundation Establishment cultivators, he was still a cultivator at that level. Yet now, without a sound, he was simply gone. Fei Loya continued, "Look around, the Golden Tang Gate's young master is dead. Crimson Reef Island and the Great Ziyuqi Temple are at war. Cultivators from the Yue cultivating sect have stopped venturing outside. Golden Feather sect and Mount Changhui are constantly at odds, and the Zhao family has sealed their mountain in seclusion. This place may seem calm, but it's already caught in a storm." Fei Loya spoke these words, but inwardly he silently added, "Your damned Li family has severed ties with the Yuan family, dismantled the Yu family, and keeps producing Foundation Establishment cultivators. Your influence in the sect is rising rapidly. It's only a matter of time before you set your sights on the lake. At least I won't lose face if I leave early." He paused for a moment before he spoke. "Besides, do you know what kind of spirit beast flew over the lake a few years ago?" Hearing this, Li Zijian immediately became interested and asked, "My family has inquired far and wide but received no news. It seems that knowledge of such ancient beasts is still preserved in Mount Wu. I humbly ask for your guidance, senior." Although Fei Loya was from Mount Yue, he had lived for over a century. Flattered by Li Zijian's words, he remained composed and simply replied, "That was Waihu, a descendant of the Hongluan. It resides upon the Tongxin tree of Mount Taishi. The mere sight of it invites calamity. Families will be torn apart and lives cast into endless exile. Leave sooner rather than later." Mount Yue cultivators were already highly superstitious about such omens. Now that Fei Loya had reached the Foundation Establishment realm, he believed in them even. With worry etched across his face, he continued, "It's not just me, Fei Loya. Zhao Zhangzi of northern Mount Yue has been missing for years. He may have met a grim fate. Now only Huo Liua in the south remains, secluded in cultivation like me." Chapter 672, Things of Mount Wu II. Li Zijian listened intently. Back when Mount Wu was divided, 4 factions remained on the southern bank. Zhao Zhangzi was the strongest, occupying Mount Wu and establishing North Mount Yue. Fu Demu took over Great Juading but was later eradicated by Fei Loya in alliance with the Li family, and Great Juading ultimately fell under Li family control. Looking at it now, the Foundation Establishment cultivators of Mount Yue, whom our elders once feared, have dwindled. Only Huo Liua, a mid-stage Foundation Establishment cultivator, remains, taking control of all Mount Yue territories. Doesn't seem difficult anymore. As he contemplated the population and spiritual resources of Mount Yue, his true desire lay in Mount Wu. Even if the cultivators at the Purple Mansion realm had already scoured it clean, It had once been the palace of Duan Mukui, a Purple Mansion realm cultivator who had dominated an era. If he could set foot there, he might unravel many mysteries. While Li Zijian was lost in thought, Fei Luoya could no longer hold back and asked, "Your esteemed family should give me an answer." As soon as he spoke, he saw Li Zijian suddenly look past him, bow respectfully, and softly say, "Zijian greets the ancestor." Fei Luoya's heart skipped a beat. His first thought was that Li Tongya was still alive, but when he extended his spiritual sense, he saw that a figure was approaching the hall at a steady pace. The figure approaching had a cold face and white beard, his brows sharp as blades, broad shoulders, and a sturdy build. His dazzling black gold spirit armor shimmered brilliantly. Fei Luoya's immortal foundation untraceable presence was highly attuned to reading the colors in others' eyes, but when he looked into this veteran's gaze, it was like being pierced by twin swords. It seemed as if this old man had just slain a monstrous beast from the sea or killed an heir of an immortal sect, still carrying the lingering scent of blood. Li Xuanfeng merely glanced at him coldly. Fei Luoya immediately turned around and cupped his hands in greeting. "So it is the golden bowstring Li Xuanfeng. I am Fei Luoya, greetings, General." Li Xuanfeng's reputation was at its peak. The direct disciples of Golden Feather Sect and Azure Pond Sect were all in seclusion, making progress in their cultivation. Meanwhile, he had made his name known with a single arrow strike against the Song family, earning a reputation as the strongest cultivator below the Purple Mansion realm. Only a few others like Tang Shedu, Shen Zai, and Yuan Chengdun could compare to him. Although Fei Luoya was of an older generation, he did not dare act superior and instead addressed him as a peer. Li Xuanfeng's combat style was entirely different from that of ordinary cultivators. He never dragged battles out to 100 exchanges. His bowstring technique was about piercing defenses and delivering swift, decisive kills, even at the cost of self-inflicted injury. If a fight lasted too long, he would be the one who couldn't hold out. Fei Luoya suddenly felt a chill on his neck, silently swallowed his saliva and thought, "This is the level of a true direct descendant of an immortal sect. Even if Zhao Zhangzi were here, he'd have no choice but to flee. I've heard he serves under Taoist Master Yuan Su. No wonder." Li Xuanfeng took a few steps forward, stopping in front of him before asking, "I heard you seek refuge and wish to leave this place." "That's correct." Fei Luoya was overjoyed and bowed deeply, saying, "I hope the general will introduce me. I am willing to follow you and defend the southern border." "Rise first." Li Xuanfeng simply said, "This matter can wait. First, tell me, where has Zhao Zhangzi gone?" Fei Luoya was slightly startled but replied, "He should have fled to the Eastern Sea. I've checked multiple times. There's no trace of him in North Mount Yue. There's only a single early cultivator at the Foundation Establishment realm left to guard the place." Li Xuanfeng knew that Zhao Zhangzi had already been at the late stage of Foundation Establishment realm many years ago and asked with doubt, did he break through to the Purple Mansion realm? Fei Luoya shook his head and said in a low voice, "Dunmu Kui never left behind any methods at the Purple Mansion realm, only methods at the Foundation Establishment realm. Otherwise, Zhao Zhangzi wouldn't have been so restless here. If he wants to seek a path forward, his only option is to head to the Eastern Sea." Li Xuanfeng nodded in acknowledgement and finally said, "Recite your cultivation technique." Li Zijian quickly took out a blank jade slip. Fei Luoya hesitated slightly but then nodded heavily. He took the jade slip, closed his eyes, and concentrated deeply as he carefully engraved the technique. A Foundation Establishment cultivator's spiritual sense was swift. Within moments, Li Zijian received the jade slip from him, swept it with his spiritual sense, and saw the title inscribed, the Concealment and Obfuscation Sutra. This technique was of the third rank, containing over 100,000 words. The phrasing carried an ancient tone, showing that Mount Wu's inheritance was indeed extraordinary. Surprisingly, it even included a complementary blade technique called Reflections on the Blood Court. This blade technique seemed more like a collection of insights. It was highly profound. It was suited for those who practiced the Concealment and Obfuscation Sutra and had already attained significant mastery in blade arts. Since it was of no direct use to him, he silently put it away. In order to assist the family, Li Xuanfeng had initially considered taking down a few Mount Yue cultivators while Taoist Master Yuan Su was still alive. But with the real concern Zhao Zhangzi now having fled, he said softly, "Since you have this intent, follow behind me for now and let's head to the southern border." Fei Luoya nodded hastily. Li Xuanfeng allowed him to return to his cave dwelling to gather his belongings. Once seated again, Li Zijian said, "Fei Luoya has lived among our family for many years and has some sense about him. If he follows the second great uncle, he won't be a burden." Li Xuanfeng nodded slightly and said in a quiet voice, "King Heng is cultivating at sea, call King Heng back. My task is nearly complete and making a move myself is becoming troublesome. These minor Mount Yue cultivators, I leave them to you all." "Yes," replied Li Zijian. Seeing Li Zijian respond, Li Xuanfeng said, "There will be changes ahead. It will no longer be suitable for me to remain in direct contact with the family, as I cannot oversee everything at once. I will watch from the shadows. I will act if there is anything I can assist with. Li Zijin once again recalled the wound on his face and softly said, "Second great uncle, take care." Li Xuanfeng dismissed the concern and paid it no mind. As Li Zijin cupped his hands in farewell, intending to summon Li Xuanxuan, Li Xuanfeng raised a hand to stop him and said, "Calling him is pointless, it would only disturb his state of mind. Just remind my elder brother to take care of himself." His actions were decisive and unhesitating. Without delay, he boarded his jade boat and departed. Li Zijin returned to the hall, glanced at Li Qinglio and asked, "How is Wire? Has he emerged from seclusion?" Li Qinglio replied, "He has already exited seclusion and reached the 4th stage of the embryonic breathing realm." Li Zijin nodded slightly, picked up his brush, dipped it in ink, and softly said, "Have the family prepare for the matters regarding Mount Yue. Once King Heng returns, we will act. A month's time should be just right, and it's best to root them out completely." Chapter 673, titled Mingwang, Morning. The morning sunlight climbed the stone steps in segments, casting a golden hue over the 2 stone beasts at the entrance. The Li family had commissioned artisans to craft these statues in the likeness of the hooked serpent, Li Wushou. The beast's tails coiled tightly while its head held high. Li Xiaowei emerged from the central hall, his brocade-lined golden boots clicking crisply against the ground. With a hand resting on the sword at his waist, he had matured significantly over the past few years. The innate aura he once carried had been restrained, no longer striking fear into those who beheld him. Even the brilliance in his eyes had gradually faded, transforming into a distinctive shade of deep brown. The once intimidating presence had seemingly vanished. He stepped forward lightly, and only in fleeting glances did a trace of cunning surface. Occasionally, his movements revealed a swiftness and agility that left others startled, making it hard to believe he was just a boy of 11. Chen Yang, clad in black armor, followed behind him. Li Xiaowei had grown taller over the years, now nearly matching his height. His expression remained unreadable as he silently trailed along. Upon reaching the main hall, he instinctively stopped outside and allowed Li Xiaowei to enter. Li Qinglio was seated at the upper end of the hall, reading a letter. Seeing him approach, he smiled and said, "Wire, you're here." Li Xiaowei was now 11 years old and had reached the 4th stage of the embryonic breathing realm. Unlike other direct descendants who were sent to the mountain for cultivation, the Li family had kept him focused on training halberd arts in the central hall. They feared that advancing too quickly would result in a weak foundation. Yet, despite the lack of visible effort, he had recently spent a few days in seclusion and broken through to the 4th stage of the embryonic breathing realm. His cultivation was progressing steadily and methodically. Draped in a wolf fur cloak, he exuded an imposing presence as he asked, "How are your eyes now?" "Good," replied Li Qinglio. Li Qinglio couldn't quite understand how he had managed it, but chose not to press the matter. Instead, he picked up a jade-bound cultivation manual from the desk and said softly, "Your uncle Zijai recently returned home and obtained this perception technique for you. Take a look at it first." Li Xiaowei strode forward and carefully took the manual. On its cover, the title read, "The Grand-Veined Golden Eyes." Since Li Qinglio had suggested taking a look first, Li Xiaowei gently flipped through the pages in the hall and read it. "In the autumn of the 5th year of Wuming, I visited my friend Xundu and met Yang Jingxin, a judge of hell. We had an engaging discussion, realizing that clarity and obscurity differ greatly, making true appearances difficult to perceive. Thus, I devised certain eye techniques and recorded them." The introduction detailed the origins of the technique, followed by an extensive exposition of its practice. It primarily instructed on refining golden pupils by tempering the eyes with mana, a process that in ancient times required only 20 years to complete. The best results could be achieved by acquiring a spiritual qi known as Bright Eve Qi, which would then significantly shorten the training period. Upon closer inspection, the final inscription bore the name Q. Li Xiaowei glanced briefly at it, while Li Qinglio softly explained, "I have inquired about Q Yan. It is said that he was a golden core cultivator of the Zheiyuan immortal mansion in the Wei state, known as True Monarch Shangyao. This perception technique was likely created in his early years. It is not of high grade and it's only 3rd rank, but it should be good enough to conceal your eyes." As Li Qinglio spoke, he motioned for Li Xiaowei to sit down and continued, "Only techniques obtained from these grotto heavens come with such detailed records of their origins. If this were an ordinary Jiangnan spell, would it even have a signature? Most of them have long since been lost to time." Seeing Li Xiaowei nod in understanding, he picked up a book and a jade slip from the table and said softly, "As for this, it is a halberd art that Elder Xuanfeng acquired from overseas. It was originally recorded within this jade slip, but since you have not yet developed spiritual sense, I have transcribed it for you. There is a copied version and the original, and both are included." Li Xiaowei received it carefully and offered a formal bow in gratitude, saying, "Thank you, Father." He glanced at the cover of the halberd manual, which read, "The Armor Cycle Soul Refining Halberd Art." Rather than immediately reading the book in the Grand Hall, Li Xiaowei changed the topic and asked, I know a little about the history of the Great Wei, but only in fragmented accounts. How many true monarchs were there? Has the family gathered any information? Li Qingliao was somewhat surprised by the sudden inquiry but responded, Our family has learned some details over the years. In ancient times, golden core cultivators roamed the world, and Dao embryos cultivators walked freely. The inland regions were several times larger than they are today, and the overseas territories were dozens of times greater. The Wei state produced several true monarchs, two from the Qi family, one of whom was Shangyao Qi Yan. As for the Li family, we had the great ancestor and the Yuan emperor. Li Xiaowei interjected, 4 true monarchs. Li Qingliao nodded in agreement and continued in a low voice. After the Wei state fell, the succeeding states of Qi, Liang, Zhao, and Yan had emperors with progressively weaker cultivation. By the end, only Emperor Zhao of Zhao state had reached the level of a true monarch. As for the present day, the state has fractured into regional divisions. There are no longer any so-called immortal states. Li Xiaowei listened and nodded slightly. Seeing that he was lost in thought and had no intention of asking further, Li Qingliao smiled and said, Let me introduce someone to you. As his words fell, a wisp of gray mist rose from the side of the hall, swirling before taking the form of a man in gray robes. His face was sharp and menacing, and he knelt on one knee, speaking in a hoarse voice, Wushao greets thee. Li Xiaowei nodded in return, while Li Qingliao said, This is Senior Wushao, a cultivator at the mid-stage of the Foundation establishment realm. The family has specially assigned him to protect you. For years, Li Wushao had been cultivating at the bottom of the lake, gradually gathering demons at the Qi cultivation realm as his subordinates to oversee the lake for him. This allowed him to avoid daily management tasks, appearing at the lake only occasionally. Originally, he had followed Li Yuexiang, but now that Li Zijia had come to take his sister away, Li Zijian had ordered him to come down from the mountain. Li Xiaowei gestured for him to rise. Li Wushao gave a crisp salute without a word and quickly faded into the shadows of the hall. The young heir observed him carefully for a moment before looking up at Li Qingliao and asking, It seems the family has matters arranged. Indeed, Li Qingliao said, You are growing older. When your great-uncle Yuanping was your age, he had already assumed leadership of the family. You also possess the bright Yang Dao lineage, and there are few true talents in the main family. This means that you will undoubtedly take on the household's responsibilities in the future. I plan to choose a location in Mount Yue. You will take some troops there, and this will be a good opportunity to train your halberd arts. When the time comes, you will experience bloodshed firsthand. The Li family had always upheld this tradition of succession. Neither father nor son showed any surprise. Li Xiaowei nodded, tucking the items into his sleeve as he prepared to leave. Just then, Li Qingliao called out to him. The young head, who was draped in wolf fur and exuding an innate charisma, smiled faintly and said in a soft voice, After careful deliberation, the family has chosen to uphold tradition, not to address you by name, but to bestow upon you a Dao title. Or rather, a noble title. Li Xiaowei raised his brows with interest, a hint of cunning flashing in his eyes as he smiled and asked, What title has the family chosen? Li Qingliao appeared pleased, laughing heartily twice before carefully writing down 2 characters on a piece of Xuan paper. He lifted it gently and said, Mingwang. Li Xiaowei narrowed his eyes slightly, resting a hand on the sword at his waist and tilting his chin downward. His expression was not so much one of satisfaction as it was a sense of ease, like a beast discovering a suitable cave to rest in. The teen mused before bursting into a resonant laugh, the light in his eyes flickering in sync with his voice. The grand hall gradually filled with the fragrant scent of peonies, accompanied by the soft rustling of fluttering wings. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The golden morning sun climbed the stone steps even faster now, slithering like a serpent as it weaved through the grand hall. Its brilliance intensified, radiating with such dazzling light that Chen Yang, who was standing outside, had to shut his eyes against the glare. Chapter 674, Dili Family I. Li Zijian had been waiting for 2 months when the narrow-eyed monk descended with the wind in front of the peak. Due to the newly replaced grand formation, he couldn't enter the mountain gate and could only wait in silence. Seeing Li Zijian approaching in white robes, King Heng remained composed, pressed his palms together, and softly said, I heard that you successfully reached the Foundation establishment realm, a result of good karma. Congratulations. Back then, Li Zijian had let him go and allowed him to seize the opportunity for a breakthrough. King Heng was truly grateful. After offering his congratulations, he heard Li Zijian say, Master Monk, you must be joking. What kind of good karma could come from my handling of King Du's affairs? My family doesn't believe in retribution. If such a thing truly existed, we could just sit and wait for it instead of being so fixated. This humble monk apologies. King Heng chanted a Buddhist phrase. He then landed on the mountain and looked around curiously. Li Zijian led him along the mountain path and softly said, This time, I've asked you to return so we can trouble you to take action and sweep the Mount Yue clean. Li Zijian had already investigated thoroughly and added, You, I, and Ximing will take action together to eliminate 2 individuals and 1 demon." Li Zijian pointed toward northern Mount Yue and said, "Zhao Zhangzi has gone missing, but in his absence, an early-stage Foundation establishment cultivator named Mu Moli remains in Mount Yue. He is said to be fiercely loyal to Zhao Zhangzi and is guarding northern Mount Yue alongside his Foundation establishment realm mount." He circled that area with an ink brush and explained, "If this person is as described, there will be no room for negotiation. We must deal with him swiftly and root him out completely." He then pointed to the remaining area in the south and continued in a low voice, "There is also a Hu Liua who is at the mid-stage of Foundation establishment realm. If he can be persuaded to surrender, we should try. If not, we will besiege and kill him." The Li family now had the foundation to back such words. Had this been 20 or 30 years earlier, they would have been laughed at. But at this moment his words carried undeniable weight. Li Zijian led him into the hall, placed the map down, and consoled him. He said, "These people from Mount Yue and Mount Wu are nothing good. No matter how many times we purge them, it will never be clean. Master Monk, you worry too much." King Heng simply looked at the densely packed village and tribe names on the map and replied, "I understand. But as your esteemed family's forces march through, I wonder how many heads will roll and how much blood will stain northern Mount Yue. I fear the number will not be a pleasant one." Li Zijian furrowed his brows, momentarily speechless. Northern Mount Yue was filled with esteemed landlords, and it was absolutely impossible for the Li family to tolerate them all. Even if the killings weren't thorough, it would still hinder future governance. How could they not kill? He could only say, "My family does not trouble the common folk. Once the pigs and dogs have been slaughtered, only then can those below have better days ahead." King Heng, being an ancient cultivator, did not approve but could only agree. Only then did Li Zijian continue, "This time I have been waiting for you because I have a matter to ask." He had been observing King Heng's expression all morning and softly said, "Northern Mount Yue is different from eastern Mount Yue. It is the ancestral land of the Yue people. Many evil shrines are hidden in the mountains, and its people have been deeply poisoned. When Giant Ixi was still around, there were constant uprisings. I fear this is not something that can be solved by mere slaughter. Master Monk, you are the most capable of swaying people's hearts in this world. Do you have a way?" Li Zijian was thinking of things from a long-term perspective. The esteemed landlords of northern Mount Yue were merely a matter of execution and sending people over to replace them. However, northern Mount Yue was the ancestral land of the Yue people, and the cult of sorcery was deeply ingrained in their hearts. Human sacrifices were common, and over 100,000 cult followers were spread across the land, with 99% of them being mere mortals. After much thought, Li Zijian realized that the easiest way to resolve this was through King Heng. After Li Zijian explained everything, King Heng's face was filled with even greater guilt as he responded, "Using spell arts, divine abilities, Taoist scriptures, or worldly temptations to make people obey is the highest form of heresy. My Liao River Temple must not partake in such things. I am deeply ashamed." It was clear that asking King Heng to sway these cult followers violated his precepts. He once again tactfully refused. Li Zijian was not too surprised by this answer and could only say with a sigh, "Then let them be killed." King Heng was momentarily stunned but quickly reacted with a bitter smile. He responded, "Li Zijian, don't try to fool me. I have cultivated among the esteemed families for many years and I know them well." Li Zijian chuckled and reassured him, saying, "The decline of the Liao River Dao lineage is partly due to such rigid adherence to rules. How can it possibly sustain itself if it remains so inflexible?" King Heng closed his eyes and replied, "The 7 northern Dao sects were once no different from my Liao River Temple. Yet by opening just a single crack, they gradually became what they are today. My temple does not strive to endure but to uphold what is true." Li Zijian said with a sigh, "If that is the case, what about the millions of common folk in them?" King Heng was momentarily speechless, with beads of sweat appearing on his forehead. Li Zijian feared he might push King Heng towards siding with the 7 Dao sects, so he said no more about it and instead smiled. "Then, Master Monk, you only need to assist me in eliminating these few Foundation establishment realm cultivators." Li Zijian kept smiling as he gently set down the brush in his hand and continued, "The matters below the mountain shall be left to my family's child prodigy." Great Juading, Fei Luoya's territory was vast. Though it was mostly hilly, the plains around Great Juading provided some stability. Over the years, as it came under Li family rule, the population steadily grew to around 50,000. Now that Fei Luoya had left with Li Xuanfeng, the land had fully fallen into the hands of the Li family. Along with this shift, many Mount Yue cultivators either departed or pledged allegiance to the Li family. On the roads of Great Juading, cavalry and soldiers galloped forward in an overwhelming procession. At the center of it all was a black carriage, glimmering with mystical light. Black banners fluttered in the air, while the carriage wheels carved long tracks into the muddy ground. Chen Yang watched as the glow from the mountain peaks faded and lifted the curtain, speaking softly, "My heir, we have arrived at Great Jueting." Inside the carriage, the young man sat cloaked in a heavy cloak with his boots propped on a cooled brazier. He carefully read the scroll in his hands, while Chen Yang kept his head lowered respectfully and dared not steal a glance at the contents of the book. The jade capital chakra of the fifth stage of the embryonic breathing realm was a major bottleneck in cultivation. Over the past 2 years, he had only barely grasped its edges. In the meantime, Li Xiaowei had already caught up to him in cultivation. Back when they first met and fought, it could be said that he had acted hastily. Li Xiaowei had relied on his weapon's advantage to subdue him. Now, however, Li Xiaowei's halberd arts had grown exceptionally refined. It far surpassed his own half-baked swordsmanship. In daily sparring, he was no longer a match and dared not act rashly. Upon hearing his words, Li Xiaowei closed his book and stepped forward in the carriage. Looking carefully ahead, he saw the towering, ancient city standing before them. The city gates, bearing the mottled scars of time, stood wide open. On either side of the road, countless esteemed families of Mount Yue knelt in submission with their heads lowered. Many had even styled their hair in the fashion of Easterners, whispering among themselves as they kneeled. He stood in silence for a moment before giving the order, "Enter the city." As soon as Li Xiaowei's words fell, the carriage did not slow before the kneeling esteemed families of Mount Yue. Instead, it sped past them and charged straight into the city. On the way, the carriage splashed up high sprays of muddy water which caused the crowd to scatter and retreat. Li Xiaowei remained silent while his family soldiers marched in coldly, sealing off both sides of the road completely. Standing at the front of the carriage, Chen Yang gazed at the sea of bowed heads. A surge of satisfaction rose in his heart. However, now that he was fully aligned with Li Xiaowei, his cunning nature resurfaced. He reminded Li Xiaowei, saying, "My heir, you have less than a month to recruit troops here. You may still need to rely on these people. It might be worth pulling a few to our side." Chen Yang's words were quite reasonable. These people were all the descendants of Fei Luoya's former subordinates. They held influence and prestige in the region. For decades, they had exploited the common folk while each controlled their own factions. The Li family's power was certainly above them, but if they could secure their cooperation, integration would be much smoother. After all, Li Qingliao had not provided any spirit items or provisions for this campaign. Great Jueting was already their territory. If they still required family support to raise an army here, it would undoubtedly be a sign of incompetence. Chapter 675, Dili Family, II. Just as Chen Yang finished speaking, he heard the rustling sound of Li Xiaowei lifting the curtain behind him, followed by the heir's cold reply, "They are all doomed men, no need to bother with them." Chen Yang raised an eyebrow slightly. His mind turned and quickly grasped the meaning. He replied with a smile, "Understood." Li Xiaowei stepped out of the carriage, silently gazing at the grand city before him. He walked into the lavish yet aging main hall and stopped beside the towering throne. He tapped his brocade boots twice against the floor, then stepped up beside the throne. He casually glanced around before turning back and said, "None of the 21 esteemed families in this city are innocent. Kill them all, distribute their wealth to our forces, and recruit a batch of men first." Chen Yang nodded, but Li Xiaowei stared at him for a moment, thinking to himself, "Father said this man is cunning and bold, but lacks the ability to command true loyalty. If I let him go alone, resentment may rise and he might stir up a mutinous force." Feeling uneasy about Chen Yang, Li Xiaowei took the halberd from the carriage and donned his armor. He shook out the robe behind him, mounted his horse, and said with a frown, "You will come with me." Chen Yang mounted his horse and followed behind Li Xiaowei. Li Xiaowei pulled out a roster and selected a family with many followers but in a weakened state. Gripping the reins of his spirit horse, he called out loudly, "To the Dili family." The city's roads were uneven and full of potholes, but his heavy-set Zhangsuo spirit horse moved as if on flat ground and swiftly galloped out of the city. In less than 15 minutes, he reached a large village near the city's edge. From afar, he could see people moving in and out. He reined in his horse, waiting for the guards to catch up before pulling his reins tighter and gazing toward the settlement. Dili family village. Dili Yaoji had spent the entire night in anxiety. Early in the morning, he was already pacing anxiously in front of the village. The bow and beast bones at his waist clanged noisily, revealing his unease. His Dili family had cultivated this land for years, boasting a large population and many warriors. Yet they lacked enough shamans. This branded them as an inferior caste, forcing them to settle outside the city and provide a steady supply of sacrifices to Fu Demu. When this land later fell under Fei Luoya's rule, years of chaotic mismanagement caused the Dili family to miss their opportunity for advancement, leaving them as lowly outcasts again. However, after the transition to the Li family, life improved significantly. The reason was simple. Previously, the Li family had little direct control over Great Jueting. Since most of Fei Luoya's subordinates had settled here, the Li family refrained from interfering too much. They were merely sending officials to survey and allocate spirit fields. It was more of a vassalage than actual rule. But this morning, Upon hearing that Li family's troops had entered the city, Dili Yaoji found himself unable to gain an audience. Aside from growing restless within the village, he was truly at a loss for what to do. Clop, clop, clop. As the long-haired warrior was lost in thought, a sudden roar of thunderous sounds jolted him awake. As someone who had wielded strong bows and ridden fierce horses among the Mount Yue people, how could he not recognize that sound? He stiffened slightly, his expression turning to alarm. He muttered, "Cavalry." He abruptly lifted his head, hastily unfastening a horn from his waist. But before he could sound it, a deafening boom rang out. Above the 10-foot-tall village gate, a dark shadow soared through the sky, blocking out the blazing sun and casting a writhing silhouette below. Dili Yaoji caught a fleeting glimpse of a gleaming halberd slicing through the air. The black and gray armor made a harsh metallic sound and gleamed with an iron sheen of a quality Mount Yue had been unable to forge for generations. HSSHHH. As the hooves landed, sand and dust burst into the air, mingling with the chaotic snorts and neighs of the spirit horse. The people within the Dili village stared in shock, their minds momentarily blank. Even Dili Yaoji, who was usually resolute, unconsciously took a step back and his stern face turned pale. Clang! The halberd struck the ground, gleaming coldly through the dust. Before he could see the man clearly, a deafening clash of metal rang out. The village gate was torn to shreds. Armored Eastern soldiers that were disciplined and orderly flowed in like a relentless tide. A few members of the Dili family attempted resistance, but they were as helpless as lambs before these men and were subdued in mere moments. Dili Yaoji immediately recognized them as the Li family's troops and dared not resist. He clenched his fists as he stood frozen in place. With a heavy thud, Dili Yaoji was pressed to the ground by several jade-armored soldiers. Amid the clanking of metal, cold blades pressed tightly against his neck. Their gleaming edges were sharp and menacing. More than a dozen iron spears encircled him, leaving him utterly immobilized. In mere moments, the entire Dili family was under control. Kneeling on the ground with disheveled hair, Dili Yaoji dared not move an inch. He felt an icy chill creeping over his body. The scorching sunlight cast a golden glow before him. Beads of sweat that were the size of soybeans dripped steadily onto the ground. Adjusting his posture slowly, Dili Yaoji raised his head and met a pair of narrow eyes tinged with a faint golden hue. The young man gave him a casual glance before surveying the surroundings, seemingly assessing the number of men present. Then he lifted the silk document in his hand and read aloud, "Dili Yaoji." The voice was calm, carrying the clarity of youth. Dili Yaoji, one of the most skilled hunters among the families within 5 kilometers and a young leader feared by many, found himself unable to meet the youth's gaze. Hoarsely he replied, "I pay my respects to the immortal family, my lord." Sweat poured down his face as that gaze forced him to lower his head. With cold steel pressed against his throat, he did not dare to move. From behind, another man dismounted from his spirit horse. His expression was icy as he circled around Dili Yaoji. With long brows and gray-black eyes, the man studied Dili Yaoji with an indifferent gaze, as if weighing his worth like that of a mere livestock. In a low voice, the man asked, "Your Highness, is this man worth using?" The youth on horseback did not answer immediately. Instead, he chuckled and asked, "Dili Yaoji, the letter says you are young and capable. I am offering you an overwhelming fortune. Will you take it?" Dili Yaoji had always been decisive, but never had his mind felt so clear. In a flash, he pieced everything together and responded with a trembling voice, "I give my thanks to the heir." Finally, he gathered the courage to meet those eyes, the eyes that were seemingly born to manipulate hearts. A dark golden hue flowed within them, sending a chill down his legs. As Dili Yaoji listened, the youth tugged his reins and the iron hooves struck the ground rhythmically. With a flick of his whip, he nudged aside the cold blade at his throat and said with amusement, "Gather your Dili family, ride into the city and kill." Chapter 676, Undefeated King of Brightness I. Dili Yaoji slowly lifted his head as the glint of cold steel and blades around him withdrew. At last, he had a chance to rise to his feet and vaguely make out the face of the heir. Li Xiaowei turned his horse and rode off, his jade court guards following suit as they withdrew from the village. Only the family soldiers remained, standing in rigid formation on both sides. Yet one figure remained unmoved. The cold, calculating young man stood there with his arms crossed, watching Dili Yaoji with an unreadable expression. The young man was Chen Yang. Chen Yang thought to himself, a lucky barbarian. Chen Yang came from the prestigious Chen family, one of the most prominent surnames among the eastern towns. He bore the blood of the Li family on his mother's side. Though he followed Li Xiaowei closely in battle, he was still considered a son of an esteemed family back in the eastern towns. Seeing himself as a celestial descendant, he inherently looked down on these barbarians. Li Xiaowei had an uncanny ability to see through people's hearts, so in his presence, Chen Yang would tuck away his claws and behave obediently in front of him. But now that Li Xiaowei was gone, he reverted to his usual self. He studied Dili Yaoji carefully with his gray-black eyes before stepping forward to help him up. His expression changed faster than a page turning, and he said with a grin, "Brother Dili, I am Chen Yang. Now that we are working together, I look forward to learn from you. Dili Yaoji quickly lowered his head, adopting a humble demeanor, and replied softly, Senior, I will follow your guidance entirely. Chen Yang nodded. His smile was warm and enthusiastic, as if they were real friends. He said with a chuckle, the 21 esteemed families in the city have long oppressed the common folk. The heir has made it clear they need not be spared. I will take the troops over, but as for gathering forces, recording their crimes, organizing the family warriors, and placing trusted men, I suppose I don't need to teach you how to handle that, do I? Dili Yaoji respectfully responded. I will make sure everything is handled properly. Chen Yang, dressed in black, feigned a playful yet fearful expression as he leaned in and whispered, Make sure not a single person or horse is overlooked. The heir lives high in the celestial mountains and fears no vengeance, but you and I have families. We cannot afford to play games with the revenge of a fallen bloodline. Dili Yaoji squinted slightly and said with a nod, I understand. As the two walked into the city, they saw weapons gleaming coldly everywhere. Chen Yang spoke in cold tone, then, please proceed. Dili Yaoji immediately understood. He unfastened the horn from his waist and brought it to his lips, blowing into it through his mustache. Riding forward, Dili Yaoji saw the shock on the plump faces of the city's esteemed families as his family warriors streamed in. A burning sense of dominance surged within him. It was like fine wine intoxicating his heart, sending him into a euphoric daze. Dili Yaoji thought the Yedan family robbed mine 2 years ago. Their heads go first. While Great Jueding was engulfed in the chaos of war, northern Mount Yue remained eerily silent. Located next to Great Jueding, northern Mount Yue was bordered by a mountain range. Beyond it lay 2 vast plains that were densely populated. Li Zijian and King Heng rode the wind and landed upon one of the great mountains. According to Fei Loya, Jiao Zhangzi was proud and ambitious. He cultivated an extremely difficult technique that did not rely much on blood qi. As a result, northern Mount Yue had a thriving population. Just the plain beneath their feet housed over 10,000 people, with numerous villages and fortresses spread across the land. Li Zijian observed carefully. At the same time, Li Ziming also arrived on a radiant gust of wind. As a mid-stage foundation establishment cultivator, his presence was imposing. His Taoist robe billowed, exuding an ethereal elegance. Li Zijian spoke softly. There is only one matter at hand. Although Jiao Zhangzi has disappeared, his subordinate Mu Moli and his foundation establishment mount are still in northern Mount Yue. We must first surround and eliminate these two. According to Fei Loya, Mu Moli cultivates the morning listening technique. It is an ancient art that allows him to perceive any unfavorable words spoken within a 50 kilometers radius. We must not get too close to Mount Wu, or he may hear us. The 3 of them needed no further speculation, as it was almost certain that Mu Moli was in Mount Wu. However, they did not know if he had any hidden reinforcements there, and could only hope to lure him out. Li Ziming responded, if Mu Moli is truly loyal, he will not sit idly by while northern Mount Yue falls into our hands. A simple visit to the northern Mount Yue royal court should be enough to force him out. Li Zijian gently shook his head, turned to King Heng and spoke in a low voice, this matter should be postponed for now. The shamanic spells that the people of Mount Yue use are strange and unpredictable, and my family has suffered losses before. This time I must trouble Master Monk to look after our heir. King Heng quickly waved his hand, closing his eyes as he replied softly, Li Zijian, please command as you see fit. I have long held a hollow title without fulfilling my duties, and my heart is already burdened with guilt. Li Zijian withdrew his gaze from the distance and looked into King Heng's eyes with a calm expression. This time I ask Master Monk to first take a look at our heir. The group rode the wind together, while King Heng, deep in thought, asked, this morning listening of the Mount Yue bears some resemblance to a certain mind-reading technique within Buddhist cultivation. If we gain anything from this encounter, I would like to examine that technique. That won't be a problem at all, Li Zijian responded casually. However, he suddenly recalled a fragment of his family's history and thought, I once heard that within the demon dens of Mount Dali, there is a great demon capable of hearing events from 1,000 miles away. It must be of the same Dao lineage as morning listening. As the sun set, the sky turned a hazy red, with drifting crimson clouds. The sounds of shouting in the city gradually faded, leaving behind a heavy silence. The villages surrounding Great Jueding shut their gates tightly, and not a single soul dared to step outside. Beneath the ancient city walls, doors remained firmly shut while the streets ran slick with blood. Throughout history, this ancient city had fallen into the hands of many rulers, and each time, slaves and commoners were sacrificed to welcome a new ruler. For the first time, it was the esteemed families and shamans being slaughtered, lending an air of grim novelty. The resistance had been particularly fierce. Cultivators filled the sky, watching as the desperate struggled in vain. A few esteemed families and shamans attempted to take flight, but they were struck down and their bodies were smashed into pulp upon impact. Chen Yang stepped out of the courtyard with his men. Severed heads, bone ornaments, and feathers lay scattered everywhere. Dozens of family soldiers carried heads into the courtyard. Chen Yang walked over the bloodied ground and wiped the blood from his left hand before saying with a grin, "This man was a lecher. 27 concubines and over 100 female slaves. Even after years of drought, he still hoarded this much grain." The soldiers of the Dili family looked uneasy. Even these hardened men had been shaken by how Chen Yang personally butchered everyone in the courtyard without hesitation, and not a single one dared to respond. Chen Yang raised an eyebrow and asked, "Was I wrong to kill them?" "It was, of course it was necessary," Dili Yaoji answered quickly. His impression of Chen Yang had shifted. He had thought that Chen Yang was merely a scheming youth, but now he realized that Chen Yang was a ruthless and bloodthirsty man. Quietly, he became more cautious. Dili Yaoji checked the records and confirmed that all members of every esteemed family in the Great Jueting had been wiped out. Their lineages were now severed, ensuring there would be no qi cultivators for at least several decades. The Li family wouldn't care. If anything, it made ruling easier. Still, the sheer scale of the slaughter made Dili Yaoji's scalp tingle. He was secretly relieved that he had survived. Chen Yang glanced at the troops on either side and ordered, "Send men to seize the 2 granaries." "Wait." His gaze darkened as he fell into thought. "The Dili family will bear the resentment. I, Chen Yang, will bear the sin of killing, but the Li family must be seen as the benefactor. If anything is mishandled, Li Xiaowei will sneer at my incompetence." He gazed at the pool of blood before him with appreciation and murmured, "Gather all these items and deliver them to the army." After speaking, he kicked aside the severed head of a beautiful woman as if it were nothing more than a discarded gourd. Then, turning to Dili Yaoji with a warm smile, he warmly patted Dili Yaoji on the shoulder and said, "Brother Dili." "Haha, General Dili, I must trouble you to present these goods and come with me to see the heir." Chapter 677, Undefeated King of Brightness, II. Dili Yaoji had fought alongside him throughout the slaughter. Even as he heard Chen Yang's laughter, he knew it couldn't be trusted. How could he trust the smile on Chen Yang's face? He now understood that Chen Yang was nothing but a venomous serpent hiding behind a grin. Fear gripped him, and he bowed repeatedly before following behind. However, Chen Yang wanted Dili Yaoji to be afraid. He showed an expression of satisfaction as he said, "General Dili, thanks for pointing out who's the guilty ones and helping with purging. I have already sent men to spread the news throughout the city so that your name can be praised far and wide." Dili Yaoji knew that there was no escaping the burden of being seen as the one who sided with the Easterners and slaughtered the families and shamans. Gritting his teeth, he replied harshly, "Lord Chen, rest assured. With this stock of spirit items and grain, all the local families and followers will align with the ruling family in just 10 days. I can raise 5,000 troops." Chen Yang nodded and stepped up to the platform. His expression shifted instantly, retracting into one of humility as he lowered his gaze. The sudden change in attitude left Dili Yaoji feeling deeply unsettled. The youth then reminded him, saying, "When serving beside the heir general, it would be best if you kept all stray thoughts at bay." Dili Yaoji nodded repeatedly and took a few steps forward in the grand hall, following Chen Yang as they knelt. From the corner of his eye, he caught sight of several Eastern-dressed cultivators standing on the other side of the hall. Chen Yang bowed and declared, "Your servant has purged the city." Li Xiaowei took a slow step forward, glanced at Dili Yaoji and said softly, "Dili Yaoji, well done, you may rise." Dili Yaoji hurriedly stood up, but he quickly realized that Chen Yang remained kneeling, motionless. A cold fear gripped him. Lowering his gaze, he saw a pair of brocade boots stop in front of him. The heir took the thick silk records from his hands and said, "Organize the troops within 12 days. We march on northern Mount Yue." Dili Yaoji nodded silently and slowly backed away. While Li Xiaowei held the jade slip in his hand, a surge of shock erupted within Chen Yang. A jade slip, spiritual sense. He has broken through the jade capital chakra of the 5th stage of the embryonic breathing realm. Standing nearby were 2 individuals, both at the qi cultivation realm. One was a young man in Taoist robes, appearing to be in his early 20s, Li Chenghui. The other was a woman slightly older than him, and she was his elder cousin from the first lineage, Li Minggong. Li Chenghui, with rather plain features, bore more resemblance to his mother, Yang Xiaor. He replied calmly, "Leave it to me." Because both of them were at the early stage of qi cultivation realm, they easily pacified the region. After a slight bow, they took their leave. The members of the Cheng and Ming generations were of mediocre talent. However, over the past 20 to 30 years, most of them had successfully reached the qi cultivation realm and gradually took charge of various peaks. Their strict upbringing ensured that those who rose to prominence were more than capable. Li Xiaowei waited for the others to leave before finally turning to Chen Yang. He stepped closer and spoke softly, "Restructure the family forces and stabilize the unsettled hearts." Chen Yang slowly lifted his head and met Xiaowei's gaze. The young heir said lightly, "There are news from the family. Master King Heng has arrived at Qingdu. Before long, the troops will march on northern Mount Yue." A surge of vigor coursed through Chen Yang. He quickly exited the great hall with his back straight and strode forward with an air of confidence. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, and with each step, the clinking of his black armor revealed his excitement. But just as he reached the front of the hall, 3 figures stood quietly before him. The leading youth carried an extraordinary presence, as though he had braved countless tempests of wind and snow. His straight brows and starry eyes carried an air of nobility, and he gave Chen Yang a slight nod. Behind him, a young man in a Taoist robe had slightly pale lips and calm, gentle features. A faint smile played at his lips as golden radiance shimmered around his body. The last figure was a narrow-eyed monk with his head lowered and expression unreadable. A cold sweat broke out over Chen Yang. Without hesitation, he dropped to his knees with a heavy thud, pressing his forehead tightly to the ground. He then humbly declared, "I pay my respects to the 3 elders." Chen Yang, Li Zijian silently observed. While his jade-white fingers on the hilt of his sword tightening slightly, he thought, this man. Over the years, his cunning and ruthlessness have become even more deeply concealed. The impulsiveness of youth has faded, making him more difficult to control. Fortunately, his maternal bloodline connects him to the 2nd lineage of the Li family, but it's just a pity he does not bear the surname Li. If such a man were a member of the Zhou and Xing generation, the heir would have little to worry about. But Chen, he will have to do. Li Zijian gently raised his hand to signal him to stand and spoke in a soft voice. "Good. You have made great progress under Elder Dong's teachings. After the northern campaign, come see me at Jade Court Peak and I will teach you some swordsmanship." Chen Yang's heart wavered between joy and unease. He longed for that swordsmanship, yet being near Li Zijian felt like sitting on pins and needles. But how could he refuse? With great honor, he bowed deeply and swiftly retreated. Li Zijian ascended the stone steps and asked King Heng, "Master Monk, what do you think of that child?" King Heng quickly waved his hand dismissively and replied, "I dare not say much, he seems like a clever child." The 3 entered the main hall, finding it empty. Li Xiaowei sat upright in a disciplined manner, appearing to have been waiting for them. As they approached, Xiaowei stood up, clasped his hands and greeted them. "I pay my respects to the esteemed elders." Li Zijian first noted King Heng's lack of reaction before addressing Li Xiaowei. "Xiaowei, there is no need to conceal it. Let the master monk take a look." Li Xiaowei's eyes suddenly gleamed. Within his Qihai acupoints, the talisman seed stirred. It swiftly transformed into a deep golden hue with layers of gold interweaving and linking together. King Heng cast a casual glance at Li Xiaowei, but the sight struck him like a scorching brand pressed against his vision. His hands clenched tightly within his sleeves, and he instinctively turned his head away. Li Zijian let Li Xiaowei stand, but kept a close watch on King Heng. He caught the subtle twitch in the monk's narrow eyes, as though he was struggling to suppress something. Li Zijian then introduced, "This is Master King Heng." Li Xiaowei spoke softly, "I pay my respects to the master." King Heng hurriedly returned the greeting and replied, "This humble monk greets the undefeated King of Brightness. There is no need for such courtesy, as I do not deserve it." Li Xiaowei raised an eyebrow. But Li Zijian, with his hands behind his back, took a step forward. He did not appear surprised as he softly asked, "Master Monk, please explain clearly." King Heng's already narrow eyes nearly closed as he lowered his voice. The heir should be of the bright Yang constitution, and yet he does not entirely resemble one. This humble monk dares not speak too much, but the bright Yang Dao lineage, in our Buddhist cultivation, corresponds to the undefeated King of Brightness. That is why I referred to him as such, undefeated King of Brightness, Li Zijian thought with a frown. At the same time, he saw that King Heng had turned slightly pale. The monk composed himself for several breaths before he said, "When I look at the heir, he appears almost as if he were the reincarnation of the undefeated King of Brightness, and yet his mind remains calm. This is highly unnatural. It must be due to an extremely pure bloodline." He lifted his head and continued with a sigh, "Moreover, his aura is obscure and indescribable. If not for my ancient cultivation heritage and the fact that the undefeated King of Brightness has a Dao lineage in my Liao River Dao lineage, I would never have been able to discern this." Chapter 678, Conqueror of the Pass, I. Li Zijian listened from the side for a while and then saw King Heng say, "Many years ago, a cultivator with the bright Yang Dao lineage once joined our Buddhist cultivation. He attained the title of Undefeated King of Brightness. His mount was a one-horned killin named Undefeated, and he achieved divine abilities such as enthralling hearts, great prosperity in offspring, and the fragrant essence of Buddhist Tao. At that time, when the Wei state fell, the undefeated King of Brightness assisted King Liang. However, King Liang fell into the river and the undefeated King of Brightness was killed. Since then, this Dao lineage has declined and vanished without a trace." Li Zijian lowered his head slightly, and King Heng added, "I do not know much either, but I have one thing to remind you of." Li Zijian hurriedly cupped his hand in respect and exclaimed, "Please enlighten me." King Heng replied, "When the undefeated King of Brightness was still an active follower of the Buddhist cultivation, he took 4 wives in total. However, all of them died suddenly. He could only indulge in pleasure with his concubines. It wasn't until he encountered someone with the veiled Yin constitution, and he was able to then form a lasting union without his wife dying suddenly. So that's how it was. If what King Heng said is true, then marrying an esteemed daughter would only bring harm to her, thought Li Zijin. He furrowed his brows slightly, contemplating that Li Xiaowei, though at the age for engagement, still had no clear match. This was indeed a troublesome matter, but now was not the time to dwell on it. It had to be postponed. With that in mind, Li Zijin asked, in that case, how much harm could the shamanic spell of Mount Yue inflict upon the air? King Heng smiled faintly and replied, this faction of Mount Yue located around Moongaze Lake could hardly harm the air. Even if another master monk from the 7 northern Dao sects helped them, they might still suffer setbacks. Good, replied Li Zijin. Now that Zijin had confirmation, he stepped forward, just as a gust of gray wind swept in from the corner. The wind coalesced at the foot of the steps, transforming into a human figure who spoke in a deep voice. Wushou greets the young master. This person was none other than Hooked Serpent, Li Wushou, who was always guarding closely. Li Zijin slightly nodded in return and said softly, then let Mingwang investigate first and the master monk oversee things. As for us, we will hide in the air and wait for the Foundation Establishment cultivator of Mount Yue to reveal himself. Li Ziming, standing beside Zijin, gave a low hum in response. He had remained silent ever since entering the hall, staring blankly at Li Xiaowei. Only now did he come to his senses and silently followed Li Zijin out. Greetings, King of Brightness, King Heng said, pressing his palms together and slowly walked behind Li Xiaowei. The young man bade the two farewell and rested his chin on his hand in contemplation. His eyes returned to their usual dark brown as he gazed quietly ahead. Li Xiaowei pondered for a moment before calling someone over and commanded, pass my orders to all the generals. The person swiftly left and the grand hall returned to its empty tranquility. The flickering lanterns cast shifting shadows as Li Xiaowei picked up the map on the table. He studied it carefully until Chen Yang, Dili Yaoji, and the others arrived. There were not many cultivators in northern Mount Yue, mainly because their cultivation methods were too weak. Fewer than 1 in 10 could even reach the qi cultivation realm, and even those who did only possessed crude and unrefined qi. Once they broke through, they were immediately sent to Mount Wu to serve as menial laborers. After all, even though Zhao Zhangzi disliked blood sacrifice, he was still part of Mount Yue. Free slaves was something he would never refuse. Regardless, even the ruler of northern Mount Yue was merely at the embryonic breathing realm, posing no real threat. Still, some caution is necessary. Once the others arrived, Li Xiaowei stood with his back to them and his eyes fixed on the map. 100 li north lay the northern Mount Yue stronghold, Chan Pass. Nestled between two mountains and fortified with formations, it was an impenetrable barrier for ordinary mortals. Yet with numerous cultivators stationed there, Chan Pass seemed rather fragile than it appeared. Chen Yang and the others had never considered northern Mount Yue a real concern, and for good reason. With the strength of the Li family, even if Li Wushou reverted to his true form and crouched outside the pass, the defenders would flee in terror. What was there to worry about? But now, after hearing the elder's words, Li Xiaowei quickly formed an understanding. He gazed at the words Chan Pass on the map and thought, the northern Mount Yue's Foundation Establishment cultivator, Mumoli, is hiding in Mount Wu. He must already know how strong my family is. If we attack with the Qingdu army, we would surely win. But why is Mumoli still bold enough to show up without hesitation? Whether he is prepared or not, he cannot win against us. What I truly fear is that he might abandon northern Mount Yue and escape, causing endless future trouble. Li Xiaowei was not one to blindly follow orders. Li Zijin intended to lure the enemy out while entrusting the matters at the foot of the mountain to him. This meant that he had certain freedom to act as he saw fit. He immediately began thinking about how the forces should be coordinated. He first asked, Dili Yaoji, if we mobilize troops tonight, how many men can we gather? Dili Yaoji gritted his teeth and replied, we have just slaughtered the opposing families and the lingering fear still holds. We can command 2,000 elite troops, 3,000 irregular soldiers, and 2,000 slaves. But they have yet to be reorganized. Morale is currently low and they may not withstand a large battle. Is Li Xiaowei planning to attack northern Mount Yue tonight? Thought Chen Yang. Chen Yang was momentarily stunned and reminded. The city has only just been pacified. If we withdraw 3,000 family troops, unforeseen changes may arise. He was still puzzling over Li Xiaowei's intentions when he heard Li Xiaowei speak in a low voice. We have just eradicated the Great Jueting, and the news has yet to spread. Gather 300 family soldiers, lead Dili's forces, and set out immediately. Only the elite troops are needed. The other untrained soldiers and slaves need not interfere. How many? 300 family soldiers, thought Chen Yang. While Chen Yang's mind was filled with doubts, Li Xiaowei had already donned his armor and taken down his halberd before saying softly, raise the Dili family's banner. As Chen Yang quickly withdrew with Dili Yaoji, the fully armored Li Xiaowei strode away, with King Heng silently following behind him. At this moment, King Heng's aura was subdued, resembling nothing more than an ordinary monk. As they exited the grand hall, the night was deep. A gust of gray wind swirled beneath King Heng's feet and Li Wushao appeared like a ghost behind him. He exhaled slowly, his breath slithering like a serpent as he spoke. "Master Monk, it has been many years." King Heng squinted and smiled, sensing that this demonic beast's aura had changed. Its demonic energy had been refined and it now carried an air of purity. Its presence now flowed like wind and rain, and his Dao foundation of water mansion, morning cold rain, now bore traces of the divine essence of orthodox immortal Dao. He couldn't help but be surprised, saying, "Wushao, your strength has greatly increased." Li Wushao remained silent. He was just a small hooked serpent, and the rapid growth of his strength over the years had certainly not come from his own cultivation alone. Ever since he agreed to stay with the Li family, Li Zijian had used the Six Dams life-matching unique technique to extract and enhance his spirituality. This technique was not an easy immortal art to succeed with. It depended entirely on the quality of the life-matching spirit item. Li Wushao had originally been prepared to risk his life for this opportunity, but he never expected that the spirit item Li Zijian used would be of such astonishingly high quality. Not only had it granted him a tremendous surge in power, but it had also left him speechless with gratitude. The spirit item sacrificed for this life matching. Even if there were 3 of me, it wouldn't be enough to compensate for it, all for the sake of ensuring success in one attempt and sparing my life in the process. Li Wushao thought. As a hooked serpent who had once wandered adrift in the Eastern Sea, he had repeatedly received spirit items and consumed treasured panaceas. There was nothing more to say, and he could only accept it in silence. He dared not speak much with King Heng, merely nodding in acknowledgement. Chapter 679, Conqueror of the Pass II. In the darkness of the night, every household in Great Jiuding City had shut their doors. Earlier, the esteemed families had been massacred, and the blood had yet to be washed away. It left the city as silent as a grave. Amidst the darkness, the elite family troops and Jade court guards were secretly withdrawn. They disguised themselves as Mount Yue warriors and quickly assembled. By the time Dili Yaoji's forces left the city, 300 soldiers were already standing before the formation like ghosts. Under the night sky, Li Xiaowei stood clad in iron armor. A crimson cloud pearl at his waist glowed faintly, while his halberd rested against the ground. Beneath him, his spirit horse at the peak stage of the embryonic breathing realm, Zhangxuo, gazed sharply into the distance with its eyes gleaming with intelligence. As a group of Mount Yue warriors slowly took their positions before him, Li Xiaowei's halberd began to glow with a faint red light. The armor cycle soul-refining halberd art. This halberd art was brought back from the Eastern Sea by Li Xuanfeng. It was written by a long-forgotten general of the ancient Liang state and was an exceptionally old halberd art. As its name suggests, it was more than just a technique or skill. This was the art of halberd. However, it was an art, not merely a martial skill. The essence of this halberd art lay in soul refinement. Each time an army was overturned, a sect annihilated, or a formation shattered, the halberd art would grow stronger. From the moment one began to learn it, dark shadows would shroud the halberd. When one mastered this halberd art to its fullest extent, it would summon raging soul phantoms, unleashing immense power. As for its rank, it was impossible to evaluate like most ancient techniques. It did not seem to belong to the traditional Purple Mansion or Golden Core Dao system, making it even harder to classify. However, anyone who could execute the moves of a halberd art that had been refined through multiple combats and honed by warfare would undoubtedly be a powerful force in leading soldiers on the battlefield. The red glow flickered quietly in the night, causing the Mount Yue warriors to glance up in alarm. As more eyes turned toward him, the red light on Li Xiaowei's halberd intensified. He spoke in a deep voice, "Dili Yaoji. Lead the troops forward slowly and don't cause any unnecessary disturbance. Hold position before Chan Pass and do not engage. Wait for my command at daybreak." Dili Yaoji was shocked and dared not let such talk spread. His voice was sharp as he rebuked them. "What nonsense are you spouting? That is." However, with Li Xiaowei's strict orders in mind, Dili Yaoji dared not reveal that Xiaowei was the heir of the Li family. He could only say, "We follow the king into the pass. Once we breach it and push north, the king's title will be proclaimed. When we take the royal court of northern Mount Yue, you and I shall be of esteemed lineage." Having voiced his ambitions, the Mount Yue warriors around him widened their eyes in shock. To the north, Li Xiaowei's horse galloped swiftly like a falling star, while King Heng followed at an unhurried pace. The young man tilted his head slightly and asked, "Master Monk, how many people still recognize the name undefeated King of Brightness today?" King Heng shook his head slightly and replied, "This name has been transliterated multiple times from the language of the northern ethnic minorities, and it has long been forgotten. Even if some recognize the title King of Brightness, they wouldn't know how many times the title has changed. It is simply how we of Liao River refer to it." "Good. Li Xiaowei responded with a single word, already grasping the situation. He mused, "It seems Bright Yang has been lost for many years. Its records and descriptions are completely erased. That is a good thing." As he spoke, Chan Pass swiftly came into view. The green stone walls, darkened by the night, looked somber and foreboding. He glanced at it twice before instructing someone to step forward and speaking in a low voice, "Knock on the gate." A man beside Li Xiaowei reined in his horse. He had thick brows, large eyes, and unkempt hair. He was Dili Yaoji's younger brother, who had come along as a guide for the Li family. Lowering his head to listen, he heard Li Xiaowei speak softly. "Tell them that Great Jueding is slaughtering the esteemed families and that we have fled to seek refuge with the remnants of northern Mount Yue. Say that this troop consists of direct descendants. As long as they let us in, we will offer our family's spirit items in full." The Dili family man nodded and quickly advanced. Li Xiaowei simply sat atop his horse in silence, completely unbothered. The disparity in strength and intelligence between the two sides was too vast, and this deception was merely a way to save time. After all, from northern Mount Yue's perspective, if this were truly the Li family, why would they bother with such elaborate schemes? A direct assault by Foundation establishment cultivators would have sufficed. Naturally, they would never suspect the Li family. Behind him, Li Wushao clearly shared the same thought. After a brief wait, he spoke in a sinister tone, "My heir, why don't I just smash through this pass and storm in at once?" Li Xiaowei gently shook his head. In the darkness, Chen Yang lay low on his horse, seemingly piecing things together in his mind. It seems he wants Chan Pass intact, to make it appear as if the Dili family is invading from the north, to avoid alerting the enemy. While Chen Yang was deep in thought, a large basket was lowered from above. A young warrior of the Dili family knelt and said, "Master, the garrison commander says the troops must wait outside. Only the one in charge may step forward." Chen Yang remarked with a small grunt, "They're somewhat cautious." Li Xiaowei spoke in a low, mocking tone, "I doubt he's just after these spirit items." Chen Yang chuckled softly, playing along. "He's most likely planning to offer up the heads of these remnants to curry favor with the Li family." Li Xiaowei planted his halberd firmly into the ground and tilted his head slightly as he said, "Senior Wushao, I'll have to trouble you. Spare the garrison commander's life. I still have use for him." Li Wushao nodded slowly before drifting weightlessly into the basket. The rope above jerked as if pulled up hastily, making the entire scene seem somewhat ironic. Once Li Wushao infiltrated their ranks, Chen Yang silently counted to 17 before the pass's grand formation was suddenly deactivated. The gate swung open, revealing a group of Mount Yue warriors kneeling inside. As Li Xiaowei rode forward, the cultivators on either side stepped back, revealing the blood-soaked ground beneath them. Heads rolled across the ground. The garrison commander trembled violently, presenting his bone sword with both hands. Li Xiaowei did not take it, but instead ascended the pass step by step. In the distance, the Dili family's forces had begun to appear. Only then did Li Xiaowei take a glance at the man from Mount Yue, who had been frightened out of his wits. The man was merely at the fourth stage of the embryonic breathing realm. After witnessing Li Wushao's skills, he collapsed onto the ground and kowtowed repeatedly as he pleaded, "Greetings, great king. Greetings, great king. Dudu is willing to serve under you and gather forces on your behalf." Li Xiaowei remained silent, his gaze causing Dudu to break out in a cold sweat. When Dili Yaoji rushed up onto the pass, the young heir simply waved his hand and spoke softly, "Revolt." Chen Yang nodded while his mind was already forming a clear plan. He said with a smile, "Draft a proclamation and spread the word. Announce to all northern Mount Yue factions that Dudu acted on a secret decree from Mount Wu and allowed Dili Yaoji into the pass to raise an army at Chan Pass." Dili Yaoji broke into a cold sweat upon hearing this. He had once again been thrust into the heart of the storm, but after glancing at Li Wushao and King Heng beside him, he quickly calmed down. Meanwhile, Chen Yang stepped forward slightly, and Li Xiaowei said with a chuckle, "Dili Yaoji is already one of our own, and northern Mount Yue will eventually find out about this. I must have a title, or else it's still rather inconvenient." Dili Yaoji didn't understand Li Xiaowei's mind as deeply as Chen Yang did, but he had his own ways of flattering him. He quickly bowed deeply and said respectfully, "Great king, your brilliance shines like the sun. In the barbarian tongue, it is called Grand Concord of Radiance. I wish to honor you with this title." Seeing Li Xiaowei nod in approval, Chen Yang quickly added, "Then let's proceed with the arrangements. Mobilize the troops. Before the northern court can react, we will march north swiftly." Li Xiaowei left the details to Chen Yang and idly gazed toward the sky. He wasn't sure where Li Zijin and the others were hiding, but he muttered to himself, "Let's see how the ruler of the northern Mount Yue reacts. It would be best if this draw Mount Wu's attention." Chapter 680, Entering the North Eye, Northern Mount Yue. The sky was shrouded in mist, but Li Zijin stood bathed in a snowy glow with his eyes shimmered with white light and a sword at his waist. He looked down to see the Dili family's troops enter the city below. A cloud of snow emerged beneath Li Zijin's feet as he activated Snow on Pine, carrying him in an ethereal drift. Mingwang is intelligent. he has already taken on a Mount Yue title. Let's test the ruler of northern Mount Yue first. Of course, Li Zijian had made similar arrangements, but he chose to test the boy first. Now that he saw that everything had been properly arranged, he nodded and felt much more at ease. Li Ziming watched in a trance. He had a mix of envy and satisfaction in his expression, his gaze lost in thought. He took out a jade bottle from his robe and said, "He has reached the 5th stage of the embryonic breathing realm. If he takes this pill, he'll reach the 6th. I also have bright spirit powder for him. If he takes it with the pill, the Qi cultivation realm will be within his reach." Li Zijian nodded, placing the items in his robe. As he looked up, he saw 2 forces leaving the city under the cover of night. "I've heard that the ruler of northern Mount Yue is no mediocre leader. He'll serve as Mingwang's whetstone." Li Ziming nodded, then suddenly asked, "Zijian, have you studied the Radiant Essence scripture carefully?" Li Zijian shook his head and replied, "I do not cultivate this Tao. I've only skimmed it for reference. Why do you ask?" Li Ziming fell silent, gathering his words before speaking softly. "I have studied the 9 secret techniques for breaking through to the Purple Mansion realm. They are all extremely difficult. Mastering 3 grants a 15% success rate. Mastering all 9 still offers less than a 50% chance, and that's without factoring in one's personal conditions. It's nowhere near that simple." Li Ziming smiled wryly as he replied, "Each secret technique is extremely difficult. You'll need decades to master even one. It's that hard," replied Li Zijian. But then his expression changed as though he understood something. He thought to himself, no wonder Ning Wan and the others have been stuck in the late stage of the Foundation establishment realm for so long. She may not even have all 9 techniques to practice. Li Ziming paused before saying, "However, the scripture also records several spirit items that can aid in breaking through to the Purple Mansion realm, such as the Radiant Celestial Stone, Killing Crow Spirit Husk, and White Blood Sap." Li Ziming listed several spirit items, each a rare and precious treasure. He then continued saying, "All of the spirit items are at the Purple Mansion realm." Li Zijian nodded slightly and replied, "Give me a list of the items. I'll have Zijia investigate and make inquiries in various places. Finding a lead would be ideal." Meanwhile, in Chan Pass, 2 passes and 6 towns, Li Xiaowei took out a map and examined it carefully. A vast plain dotted with numerous strongholds and a major town lay behind Chan Pass. Further beyond the plain was Moonlight Valley, another crucial pass which guarded the remaining 5 towns and the royal court. In the past, their ancestor, Li Ziyingping, had been able to move freely in this region. However, that was primarily because of 2 factors. First, he had a small and inconspicuous force. Secondly, a great drought had struck at the time, and the lands of Mount Yue had just been ravaged by giant Ixi. The region had been in complete ruin. Now, with thousands of troops under Li Xiaowei's command and with control over Chan Pass, where Xiyingping had once been cornered in the north, their fate was bound to be different. Li Xiaowei pondered for a moment and thought to himself, better to press the attack in one swift strike. Li Xiaowei descended from the pass and swiftly mounted his horse. He ordered the Mount Yue general, Du Du, to gather the troops and slaves. Standing atop the platform, he held his halberd up as his armor gleamed with a cold light. Some of the soldiers of the Mount Yue forces wore armor, while the slaves were mostly bare-chested. It was evident that Du Du had at least somewhat trained them, preventing complete disorder. However, they were still far from disciplined. The warriors of Mount Yue looked around in confusion, as if it made no difference to them who their commander was. Only the eyes of a few revealed greed as they stared at the weapons piled atop the platform. Li Xiaowei's gaze swept across the filthy and wretched faces of the Mount Yue soldiers. A strange red glow began to emanate from his halberd, as if it could captivate souls. The Mount Yue warriors instinctively raised their heads toward him. Those stationed to guard the pass were not of noble birth. In fact, most were slaves. They lifted their heads weakly, watching batches of provisions being brought onto the platform as they whispered among themselves. "Gentlemen," Li Xiaowei's voice echoed within the pass. It was deep and low as it hung in the air. It carried an almost bewitching quality. "I am the Grand Conquered of Radiance, commanded by the mandate of heaven to conquer the Northern Court. It is my intention to first slaughter the esteemed families and distribute the farmland in towns taken by our forces. When we conquer the Northern Court, all slaves shall be freed from their servitude. Distribute farmland. Freedom from slavery. Does this general truly mean it?" Li Xiaowei paused, then repeated himself. His voice became more ethereal and carried a mesmerizing force. The doubt and suspicion in the Mount Yue warriors' eyes gradually faded away and was replaced by a surging, fervent greed. A touch of red began to glimmer deep in their eyes. They exchanged glances and stepped forward one by one to pick up the weapons before them. They were as fervent as a pack of starving wolves. Chen Yang stood to the side and stared blankly. The voice had sunk into his brain without resistance. Even as a cultivator at the 4th stage of the embryonic breathing realm, he felt a momentary surge of excitement. However, Chen Yang had a resolute mind. He quickly regained his senses and looked up at Li Xiaowei's glowing, ghostly eyes before hastily lowering his head. His heart quivered as he thought, so this is what Giant Ixi was like back then. Dili Yaoji stepped forward to report. He had already organized the troops and assigned personnel. Li Xiaowei's spirit horse moved swiftly, leading the orderly tide of soldiers as they surged toward the towns hidden in the night. The large town only had few guards to begin with. Before they could even react, several arrows shot through the air, felling them instantly. A few shamans swiftly scaled the walls and the gates swung open with a thunderous crash. Li Xiaowei rode into the town atop his horse, the golden glow in his eyes flickering faintly. He could feel the soldiers following him in a trance-like state, as if a deep-seated instinct was gradually awakening within them. He quickly reined in his horse and looked toward the stone tower at the village entrance. His silent yet frenzied troops poured into the town like waves splitting against rocks. They swept through the settlement in eerie silence. A cacophony of voices rose around Li Xiaowei as he stared at the stone tower, a strange thought suddenly surfacing in his mind. I should be seated in a temple, presiding over an ancestral shrine. He stood still as whispers spread like a Buddhist chant among the Mount Yue warriors. They all murmured. In conquered towns, slaughter the esteemed families first, then distribute the farmland. When the northern court is conquered, all slaves shall be freed. The Mount Yue warriors repeated the chant under their breath as they ran through the town. Small fires ignited across the settlements as they fought in the darkness. The cries of battle grew louder and louder until they merged into a singular voice. Grand Conquered of Radiance. The chant made the Mount Yue warriors flush with battle fervor. Behind Li Xiaowei, King Heng clutched a string of plain wooden prayer beads. He twisted them so tightly that they creaked. He was unable to conceal the shock on his face as he murmured, a name destined for victory, Grand Conquered of Radiance. A wisp of gray smoke gathered beside King Heng, and the haunting voice of Li Wushao rang out. Master Monk, what are you thinking? King Heng merely shook his head with a bitter smile and replied, Wushao, you are overly cautious. As the two Foundation establishment cultivators conversed in hushed tones, Li Xiaowei spurred his horse forward and swiftly passed through the crowd. After securing control of the town, he rode toward the surrounding villages, bolstering his forces by another 200 or 300 men. They marched quickly, leaving only a trail of blood behind them. Li Xiaowei sent Chen Yang and Dili Yaoji to lead separate units to conscript more troops while he galloped forward without hesitation. He no longer lingered in these villages and swiftly advanced toward the next pass. But before Li Xiaowei arrived, a gust of gray wind swept past and deposited 2 jade bottles in his hands. One was green and the other white, but both bottles were exquisitely crafted. Li Xiaowei inspected the contents using his divine sense before swiftly stowing them away. The valley before him was narrow, with troops stationed on both mountains. The pass was wedged between 2 gorges and appeared somewhat dilapidated. His troops were lined up neatly as they paused for a brief moment at the valley's entrance. Li Xiaowei looked to the side and addressed a Mount Yue soldier beside him. Is this Moonlight Valley? The soldier nodded, bowed, and respectfully replied, My lord, this place once belonged to the Moonlight family, named after the rumored priest Yue Zhu. During the Great Drought, the priest was slaughtered by the Easterners, yet it remains known as Moonlight Valley. Li Xiaowei narrowed his eyes slightly, thinking to himself, so it was here slaughtered by my ancestor. Raising his halberd, he gazed at the narrow valley ahead and murmured, Take this pass, then I'll find an opportunity to break through.